I grew up an only child, just me and my mom. She had me at an early age, 19.
In the 1980s, Monty Smith is an only child, growing up in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. His dad is not present in his life, so his mom is everything to Monty.
She was about 5'1", little woman, but she was spicy. Straight to the point with me. She's like, I'm not gonna let you grow up be a bad kid. I'm gonna be telling you what's right and wrong. She was good at that.
He was very close to his mom. That was his rock. I have childhood memories of Monty and I, playing in the backyard while our mothers were inside, doing their thing.
Monty's mother is in ill health for most of his childhood with kidney disease.
My mom was on dialysis for my whole life. 3 days a week, we had to go to the hospital, and for 8 hours at a time for her to do dialysis. She was a very strong woman, though. She still, was able to hold the job down, too.
He was going to school. He was at home, making sure his mom had what she needed or they needed. He definitely had to grow up a lot faster than the rest of us.
Whenever Monty gets the chance, he heads to the basketball court with his best friend, Jermaine.
Basketball was a big thing, so we played basketball nonstop. Everybody wanted to be the star player, the most popular.
We always had a ball in our hand. For Monty, it was strictly basketball. He was a very good basketball player.
After graduating from high school, Monty attends college, but he and Jermaine still have time to play ball. This is how they meet Monty's first love, Tabitha Lynch, in 1993.
Tabitha and Monty grew close very quickly. The way that they looked at each other, I could tell that was his first love.
We were a magnet towards each other. I did kind of feel like I, was a lucky guy because we just always had a good time together no matter what we did. There was never any arguing, just had fun all the time.
After dating for 3 years, Monty and Tabitha eventually drift apart.
She was in college playing basketball, and so was I. She was at a different school, so we didn't get to see each other a lot.
I know life happens, but I would have definitely liked to have seen them stay together back in those days. That was definitely the one that got away from Monty.
After college, Monty becomes a mechanic and gets married. But 10 years later, as his mother's health deteriorates, so too does his marriage.
Monty, of course, wanted to be around his mother more. Definitely played a role in his relationship with his wife.
After me and my wife had split up, my mother had a stroke. And then there was, just her health just went quickly.
It took a rough toll, and it took a toll on him mentally.
But the day that I found out that she passed, I was on a motorcycle ride out of town. That was a hard moment, and I was crying inside my helmet. I felt empty after my mom's gone, I was just trying to get through one day at a time and hide my emotions from everybody, I worked as much as I could. I developed this new passion for motorcycles. So I just, get on my bike and ride when I could. That was my escape.
On Halloween night in 2010, Monty's life begins looking up when he attends a party at a local club.
So we walk in, there was a lot of good costumes there. I was standing there and someone just kind of grabbed me by my shirt, and before I can get a chance to see what was happening, I was being pulled onto the dance floor, and then never even faced me. She's just looking the other way and dancing with me. I didn't know what to think about her at first. I was like, that's kind of aggressive approach right there. So then that song was over, and I walked over to the stand by the bar area, and then she came with me. I said, my name's Monty. And she said, oh, my name's Shayna.
Shayna Sims is a 22-year-old hairstylist.
She was about the same height as me, and that's kind of tall for a woman. She had dark hair, pretty face. There we just kept talking. She stayed by my side for the rest of the night. That was a nice feeling to have a pretty girl like that interested in me, because I was kind of feeling down on myself a little bit, right before that happened. We went back to her house. I spent the night there with her the first night, just talking and hanging out till the sun came up.
The relationship moves quickly, and a few months later, in January 2011, they move in together.
It was never a dull moment, I'll say that. We had fun, did a lot of things together.
I remember him being excited when he told me that he had met Shayna and how he lit up when he talked about Shayna originally.
The next thing I know, we started talking about, well, maybe we should get married.
Just a few weeks later, Monty surprises Shayna with a ring.
So we're at dinner. I waited for the right moment, and then I got down on one knee. I asked her, to marry me, and she said yes. I put the ring on her finger. She just was very excited and happy.
He was all in on this relationship, and this is what he wanted. She seemed to be feeling the same way, so I was very supportive.
We had decided to get married at the Tulsa Historical Society. She did all the prep work herself, which I was kind of amazed by that. I was really nervous, but from the moment that I seen her come out, and I seen that smile on her face, it felt right. Everybody was encouraging to us. It was a great day.
He wanted to be the husband and the father and the family man that he never had. So he very much looked forward to that.
I had came home from work one day and she had this smile on her face. And I'm like, what are you smiling about? So I think I remember her saying, come here, I want to show you something. So she showed me the pregnancy test. It showed positive and I felt happy, excited to be a dad.
As an expectant father, Monty is fully invested in Shayna having a healthy pregnancy. So he is surprised and concerned one day when he becomes aware of a potential problem.
We had a doctor's appointment, just normal routine. The doctors came into the room and told us they did not support my mother taking pain medication during pregnancy.
Shayna, who had been complaining of leg pain, has been self-medicating for months with Percocet and Lortabs, both highly addictive opioids.
She went to a pain specialist doctor, and I was unaware of this. So I was at work at this time, so I'm pretty sure that she did not tell them that she was pregnant, and they proceeded to help her with her pain level.
Her obstetrician has become aware of Shayna's drug use through routine lab tests.
They could not help her anymore, that she needed to look for another doctor to help deliver her baby. I was furious. I can't believe that you could endanger your child like that. I found the medication in her purse, confronted her. I said, you're not taking any more of these right now because I'm taking them from you. So you can't have these anymore.
Monty's daughter is born 6 months later.
She came out, she heard my voice and stopped crying and opened her eyes and looked for me. At that moment, our bond was created. She's healthy, no problems whatsoever. I was very happy about that, and that the things that her mom had done early on did not affect her. Shayna seemed happy to be a new mom again to this pretty little girl. At that point, we had a good relationship pretty much. After my daughter was just a few months old, I switched to night shift on my job. So 3 in the evenings till midnight, working hard to provide as much as I can for my family since I'm the only one working right now.
While Monty works, he believes his baby daughter is tucked safely in bed during his shift. But he is wrong.
I would come home at midnight. I would notice that she's just getting home right when I am and bringing my daughter in the house, out of the car seat. She hadn't been home all evening long. She just said, I'm out running errands. It's okay. She said, I don't see anything wrong with that. I told her that she shouldn't be out with my daughter all evening long, that she needed to be home in the bed. I started to become more aggravated. We had a lot of arguments.
One night, Monty arrives home to find Shayna in bed, although she's not quite alone.
She's passed out. Her phone is laying face up on the bed and is on FaceTime with some other young man that I do not know. I couldn't believe it.
And I started seeing the signs from Shayna that maybe she wasn't the person that she's seeming to be. She became very evil very quickly.
Monty Smith has just found his wife Shayna in bed and on FaceTime with another man.
I look at the phone, she's passed out, unaware that I'm even right there looking at her phone. No clue. A lot of things went through my mind. But number one was, how could you? My daughter's right there in the other room. The next day, I brought it up and talked to her about it. And she said, well, I don't remember that. Denial.
Monty did mention a lot that Shayna would just lie about nothing, lie to be lying.
I was pretty upset, pretty angry. At this point, the trust is gone.
When I hear these things myself, I'm thinking, Monty, you got to do something about this before it gets worse.
And indeed, things do get worse.
One day we have an argument. She's, not letting me go out the door. I said, I have to go to work. Excuse me, move out of my way. And then she says, no, you're not going to touch me. If you do, you're going to go to jail. And I said, what do you mean by that?
This is when Shayna reveals just how low she will sink to get her own way.
She's like, well, because you're black. And they're going to take you to jail before they would me. After her saying that to me, I was really, really done. And I wanted to just leave.
They do have a daughter together. That was the main reason for Monty wanting to stay. He wanted to not have a broken home. So he made his decisions to stay.
Soon, Shayna's erratic behavior escalates outside the home.
Monty had taken Shayna to go tan. He stayed outside in the car with the baby.
Unbeknownst to Monty, while inside, Shayna overreacts to something trivial and flies off the handle.
While he was sitting in the car with the baby, 2 police cars pulled up outside the tanning salon. He said, hey man, I think something's happening. And yeah, she was having a scene inside the tanning salon, ended up, cursing out some ladies that worked there and may call the cops, and, they eventually, kicked her out. It was at that point I told him, I said, hey man, I love you, brother, but you need to figure this out.
I had friends that I had confided in about my problems at home. They just kind of let me know how messed up the situation was that I was in and what am I going to do next.
Around November 2014, an ex-girlfriend reaches out to Monty on social media. Her name is Christina Perez.
We had said hello to each other on Facebook. I think she may have asked, what my situation was, and probably told her, I was unhappy.
Monty and Christina do not meet in person, but continue to chat occasionally online until Shayna finds out.
So I came home from work one day and Shayna asked me who this Christina girl was, and I was like, oh gosh, here we go.
Shayna thought that Christina was the enemy and was trying to take her man.
She was mad about this situation that she thought was going on. So I am accused of having an affair with Christina.
The situation escalates when Shayna tracks down Christina's home and her place of work.
She's showing up at Christina's job, sitting outside, and it's getting more and more aggressive, their tone every day.
and then it blew up from there.
One day when I got home from work, they were talking to each other, and I could hear Christina on speakerphone saying, "I know what you did to my car." And I'm calling the police. Shayna had slashed Christina's tires. I mean, I'm blown away. I'm thinking to myself, who is this person?
She was slashing this woman's tires. She was following this woman. She was doing all these crazy things to this woman who had dated her husband 5 years ago.
I couldn't believe it. It first started out, with Shayna acting out in public and then escalating to slashing someone's tires. What's next? At that point, I knew that Shayna was crazy.
After the tire slashing, it's just getting worse and worse each day. They're making threats towards each other at this point.
Christina doesn't retaliate, and Monty stops contacting her. But things come to a head when Shayna decides to file a protective order against Christina.
We go to the courthouse. I'm with her, me and my daughter. Sitting in the lobby just waiting. Looked down the hallway and saw Christina.
By chance, Christina is at the courthouse as well to file a protective order against Shayna.
And of course, they gave each other mean looks. And the next thing I know, they're walking towards each other. And my wife is holding my daughter. And they wanted to exchange words with each other. And then they swung at each other. As soon as they throw punches at each other, I'm grabbing my daughter out of harm's way. My daughter's crying. It was quite intense. The deputies came out and separated everybody. They took them back in the holding areas until they figure out what happened.
And thank goodness there was tape. So the deputies pull it, and of course they see Christina is innocent, that Shayna has purposefully knocked into this woman and then starts screaming about Christina attacking her.
They realized that the child had been endangered in this encounter. So my wife was charged with child endangerment.
Shayna is put on probation for a year, and Christina is granted a protective order against her.
I did feel trapped in this, I'm not gonna call it a marriage anymore. I felt trapped in this situation. But because my daughter's involved in this, and I can't just take off.
Monty doesn't hear from Christina again. Meantime, out of the blue, a few months later, Monty gets a message from another girlfriend from his past, Tabitha Lynch, his first love.
She had contacted me through Facebook and said, "Hey, how's it going?" We chatted a little bit and then exchanged a number to talk. Her contacting me was kind of like a breath of fresh air. It was nice to hear from her and, see how she was doing in her life.
It's been over 20 years since Monty and Tabitha dated each other. Tabitha is divorced with 2 children of her own.
I didn't know all the details going on in her life at this time, but she just, told me that she had kids and they were doing good. And once she found out that I was having problems with my wife, she's like, "I'd like to reach out to her and talk to her." I just didn't think it was a good idea. I didn't know what to expect from Shayna. I was like, "No, it's okay. I got this under control. I'm gonna handle it my way." But one day after returning home from work, I walked to the door and Shayna was upset. She's like, "Tabitha has reached out to me and said that you and her have been talking and that I'm a terrible mom and a terrible wife." And so she asked me, "Who's this bitch?"
Shayna was very angry because she felt that Tabitha was a threat.
She can't stop victimizing people. I would say she is one of the most bizarre people I've ever covered in 31 years of covering crime.
Shayna was very jealous, very vindictive, very evil.
Shayna Smith is enraged when she receives a warning message from her husband Monty's former girlfriend, Tabitha Lynch.
Tabitha did send a message to Shayna, basically telling her that, she's losing the best thing that she could ever have, and she needs to change her ways before she screws it up.
Shayna took that as disrespect and did not like what she heard because it's coming from another woman. And she asked me, are y'all messing around? And I said, no.
Shayna is determined to have it out with Tabitha face to face, but she can't seem to locate her.
She's constantly asking me where to find her at. I said, I don't know. I was kind of worried about these two women having the interaction with each other because I don't know what Shayna's capable of.
But Shayna never gets the chance to confront Tabitha because one day, Tabitha suddenly becomes critically ill.
Tabitha had started having some health issues, and eventually she went into the hospital and didn't make it out.
2 months after reconnecting with Monty, Tabitha dies unexpectedly from natural causes.
Tabitha was like a sister to me, so it hurt me deeply.
I was like, I can't believe it. It seemed like I just talked to her just the other day and everything was fine.
Monty consoles himself that at least she's out of harm's way from Shayna.
I told Shayna that Tabitha passed away. She acted cold and heartless. She didn't care. The next words out of her mouth were, "Oh, good. That's what that bitch gets." My jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe that. I just heard her say that about Tabitha's death. I was already emotionally removed. I was ready to be physically removed. I didn't want to know her anymore.
The viewing for Tabitha Lynch is held in April of 2015 at a funeral chapel in East Tulsa.
I was there Thursday afternoon, probably between 1 and 2 o'clock. It hurt my heart. It was like a member of my family had passed away.
As the viewing ends, the family is taking a break outside when a stranger slips inside, presumably to pay her last respects.
Tabitha's mother happens to see this woman who looks like she's going and actually reaching into the casket. Something seems odd. It's reported to other family members. That woman is now gone, but the family goes to inspect Tabitha's body, and clearly her body has been touched. She's got a straight, cut right from the top of her head, right close to the bridge of her nose.
Her hair's been cut, and then her pants have been pulled down, her outfit has been pulled down. Her shoes that were specially made just for her that were in her casket, they're now gone. Everybody, they're just in shock. You realize that some crazy woman has come in here and desecrated this body.
Here you've got just absolute pandemonium unfolding. It's just, you can't put into words how devastating that was for this victim's family to just see.
There is one thing that we always hold sacred in this country, and that is how you treat a person who's passed away. And this just violated every tenet of that for sure.
Tabitha's family place a call to the police.
This is never a call you ever get, ever. I mean, it just gets crazier from there.
And so the officers at that time, when they got there, they see Tabitha, they see a disheveled body lying in a casket. They see that the makeup is messed up. They see that the incision on her face. And those are all really unusual things. Those are things that should not have happened and that the officers were shocked to see. It feels like the crime was a personal attack on this person. They start taking photographs, they start collecting evidence, looking around, looking at the body, making observations.
And down next to the casket, there's hair. Tabitha's hair has been cut, and there's some of the hair laying on the ground.
While police are processing the crime scene at the funeral home, another call is placed to dispatch from Tabitha's family, who are now at her apartment.
They learned that the suspect may possibly be at the apartment.
They're reporting, we think this person who was just down at the funeral home is over at our house. We need to get somebody over here right now.
Hours earlier, Monty Smith receives a disturbing message from Shayna.
I opened it up and looked at it, and It was a picture of Tabitha in her casket. I was very shocked to see her with this picture. I didn't understand why. Why do you have this picture? You know, where did you get this from? And then she also said, that bitch looks ugly in her casket. I can't believe you're messing with her. I was confused. I didn't know what she meant by that.
Once Monty finds out what Shayna has done, his life will never be the same.
It's beyond me, you know, why she would do what she did.
I've seen a lot of strange cases in my 31 years, and this one takes the cake. So many twists and turns along the way, and then it became frightening and more bizarre. It just became crazy.
After receiving the pictures from Shayna, Monty Smith returns home to find her in a frenzied state.
Shayna says, take your daughter out of the car and grab her car seat too. After I took my daughter out, she drove off. That left me and my daughter sitting there. This was probably about 5:30 in the evening. Had no clue where she was going.
It's 7:30 p.m. when police arrive at Tabitha's apartment.
They meet a bunch of Tabitha's family outside in the parking lot. And at that point, Tabitha's family tells them, there's someone inside our apartment and we didn't invite her in.
It's a heightened level of tension for the family members. It's like she's inside.
They learned that this woman had showed up at the door of Tabitha Lynch's apartment. She says, my name's Stephanie, and I'm here because something happened to your mother's makeup at the funeral home.
The woman claims she wanted a photo of Tabitha in order to fix her makeup.
And so she makes up this ruse to get inside the apartment, and at some point, the family kind of gets suspicious. So the police go inside the apartment, and what they find is this disheveled, jittery-looking woman who appears out of place. She doesn't seem like she belongs there.
Police search the suspect and discover incriminating evidence.
They find a knife and a box cutter in her pockets. They find some hair in her pocket. And so it was apparent to them at that point that this person was related to what had happened at the funeral home. A few of the family members recognized this girl who identified herself as Stephanie as actually Shayna Sims. And when they start talking to police officers, they tell them that Shayna is actually the wife of Monty Smith, and Monty is a longtime friend of Tabitha Lynch.
Monty is putting his daughter to bed when his phone rings.
It was Shayna. Her voice was shaky. She's telling me, come save her. Then the next thing, I heard voices in the background, and she was telling them to stop and let her go. And they said, no, you're not going anywhere. And I was like, who's that in the background? What are you talking about? And she said, I'm at your dead bitch's house. You can't be. What do you mean? So I got my daughter up and I drove to Tabitha's home. As I'm driving over there, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what all just happened. And then once I arrived there, it was already chaos at that point. They have Shayna in the police car. As soon as they open the car door, she's trying to tell me that she's being accused of messing with Tabitha's body and that they're saying that she's, stole some stuff from them. She did not. That's why I told them to close the door. I didn't want to hear anymore.
Police believe Shayna wanted to break into Tabitha's apartment to steal a personal item she could keep as a trophy. The next day, the Tulsa media seizes on the story.
We immediately went to the scene to try to figure out what on earth was happening. And just what we learned that day, nobody in their right mind would go into a funeral home and do these terrible things to someone who's already passed away. Because what threat are they at that point?
Shayna's act of desecration is so unusual that police are hard-pressed to find the correct laws with which to charge her.
They initially charged her with burglary because she had entered the apartment under false pretenses. They charged her with illegal dissection because that was essentially the closest thing they could find to coming up with that cut on Tabitha's face.
They told me what she was being charged with, and I'm blown away. 100% total shock.
That is a whole new level of crazy. It's way beyond anything that I could ever imagine someone doing.
It seems impossible, but things actually get crazier.
My sergeant came in and said, "Hey, I got a message from the funeral home that we need to go out and take a look at the body again." I grabbed one of my detective partners and my sergeant, and we went out there. So when we examined the body, we found that Tabitha's breasts had been crudely cut out of her body. We also noticed that one of her toes was missing. I had, at that point, worked hundreds of homicides as a crime scene detective, and I had not ever seen anything like this.
The investigators talk with Monty, who shows them the photographs that Shayna had texted him the previous day. They are the equivalent of a smoking gun.
So I see a hand holding a knife next to a toe. I recognize that as probably Tabitha's foot. And I see there's photographs of a hand next to what I assume to be Tabitha's genitalia. And I realize that I'm looking at photographs of Shayna in the act, committing these heinous acts at the funeral home.
I was disturbed, kind of, heartbroken. Couldn't believe that she did this to someone that I knew and that had passed away. A total disrespect.
How you were going to explain those photos? I mean, that just kind of seals her fate. Pictures of what she's actually doing.
When the case goes to trial in April 2016, Shayna is charged with 3 misdemeanors and 2 felonies.
A woman accused of slashing the body of her husband's former girlfriend is expected in court today.
This is a case that is revenge. This is the ex getting involved with her husband, and so she's going to do something about that.
I don't remember any emotion from Shayna. The defense had tried very early on in the process to say she wasn't competent to stand trial because she's got, mental issues, but she was given a thorough exam. That was part of her pre-trial process, and she was found competent to stand trial. The defense were like, look, she's just a woman pushed over the edge like any woman would be. Her husband's having an affair, the victim is texting her and rubbing her face in it. What else would a woman do?
The prosecution call a number of witnesses, including Monty.
Seeing Shayna in the courtroom and being asked questions, and she's staring at me, trying to intimidate me. I answered the questions and try to get through it.
And then the jury goes out. It's right before lunchtime. It's like 11:45 in the morning. And I didn't think it would take too long. So 3 hours later, almost to the minute, they called us back in the courtroom, and that's when the verdict was read.
They found her guilty of all the counts. All those counts were ordered to run consecutive. It all totaled up to 16 total years.
I guess you could say I felt a kind of peace.
Monty divorces Shayna a year later and gets full custody of their daughter.
I can't imagine, what he had to go through, what he had to tell his daughter, all the ramifications of that. That's tough.
Less than 4 years into Shayna's sentence, a new law is struck in Oklahoma that gives her a loophole to appeal.
Shayna Sims has been released from prison after serving 4 years of her sentence.
I was like, she can't be. There's no way. I couldn't believe it. I was in shock.
It was just a gut punch to everybody.
It was devastating to me when I found out. I felt rage at that point. I couldn't believe it.
In November 2021, Monty Smith's ex-wife Shayna Sims is set free, less than 4 years into a 16-year sentence for desecrating Tabitha Lynch's body.
I was like, she can't be. There's no way. But sure enough, I did get confirmation message later that day that she was released. I actually saw a video of her being released.
She just gets to walk. She spends a few years in prison for all the damage she's caused, and she gets to walk.
You couldn't ask for a more devastating blow to the victim's family.
It was a shock It was really a kick in the gut that we learned that she was going to be walking free after we put this case together. And to have someone walking free was tough to swallow.
Shayna has been released on appeal as a result of a Supreme Court ruling known as the McGirt decision.
The McGirt decision, in essence, basically told Oklahoma if somebody was a Native American, either as a defendant or as a victim, that the state of Oklahoma had no jurisdiction to handle those prosecutions.
The United States Supreme Court said that the state of Oklahoma can't arrest Native Americans. Our prosecutors can't prosecute crimes involving Native Americans. And so that brought into question thousands and thousands of cases over the years where a Native American was either a victim or a suspect.
This new law is supposed to protect Native Americans.
But what did Shayna Sims do? She figured out that Tabitha had Native American blood in her. You can't prosecute me for this crime. And literally, she got her case dismissed because of that McGirt decision. Shayna Sims, somebody has zero Native American blood in her, gets the benefit of victimizing somebody who was a Native American and walks around as though she's got no consequences. It's just so upsetting.
Once Shayna is out of jail, she can't seem to stay out of trouble.
Monty was worried about what she might do. Of course, the victim's family, Tabitha's family, was really worried and stressed about what she might do or who she might target. She gets arrested for stealing a car, then gets in trouble for assaulting her mother. It's just one thing after another. Monty's big concern was protecting his daughter, because now that she's free, what would stop her from trying to get custody?
I got a phone call from Shayna wanting to speak with her daughter. I did not know, I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. I ignored it for the first few days. She kept calling.
He didn't know what her plans were or what she was capable of doing now that she's out of jail.
Monty talks with their daughter, who tells him she wants to meet her mother. He drops her off for a weekend at her grandmother's house, where Shayna is staying.
Thought to myself, give it a try just one time and see how it goes. Shayna and her mom, they were yelling at each other and having confrontation in front of my daughter when she's not used to seeing that. And she told me herself that she didn't want to be around that, and she didn't want to see them. So I did not force her at that point to go back anymore. And that's where we are to this current day.
Monty still has full custody of his daughter. So yes, he, was doing his best to keep his daughter safe, to keep Shayna away.
Despite being warned about not going anywhere near Tabitha's relatives, Shayna defies the order.
And then, sure enough, Shayna then goes to the victim's family's apartment, and she's like, oh, I wasn't there to see them, which is a lie. You're only there to harass that poor family who's already been through so much. All you have to do to stay out of jail is stay over in your county. But she can't help herself again. She comes over here, and of course, that puts the family in terror. They are afraid of why she keeps showing up there and what she might do. And so, of course, yes, she's arrested and put back in.
Recognizing that Shayna is still a threat, Oklahoma state prosecutors file an appeal.
We had another case. It was called Castro Huerta, which was somebody who was clearly not a Native American, who had victimized children who were Native American. And we took that fact pattern back up to the United States Supreme Court and asked them to revisit, in essence, the McGirt decision. So then we immediately took that decision, petitioned the court, got her dismissal set aside, and remanded Shayna Sims back to prison, which is where she's at today.
In February 2023, Shayna's sentence and conviction are reinstated, and she is sent back to prison to serve the remaining 12 years.
So it's definitely a relief, for all of us that she's back in jail. Me personally, I don't think 16 years is long enough.
I'm at peace in my life. My daughter's at peace. She's happy. I've never let this be a problem for her.
Monty has this smile that whenever he's in good spirits, and it shows. He just glows. And I love to see my brother when he's happy and when everything is going good.
I feel like after all this is said and done, it's like looking at the damage after a tornado or after a disaster, and how are you gonna put your life back together after this?
I don't know of any person that could have withstanded what he had to go through, especially these past 6 or 7 years. But he did it. So I always love him for that.
I'm still in the stages of putting my life back together and moving forward. But it's built me to be a stronger person and better dad.
There is a profound and unspoken promise inherent in the architecture of our justice system. When you step onto the grounds of a courthouse, regardless of where you are in the world, you enter a sanctuary of order. It is a place deliberately designed to stand as a fortress against the chaos of the outside world, a designated arena where grievances are settled not with violence, but with procedure, evidence, and the rule of law. We surrender our primal instincts at the door, trusting that the institution will protect the innocent, hold the guilty accountable, and above all, maintain a physical and psychological perimeter of absolute safety. But what happens when that ultimate sanctuary is violated? What happens when the very ground intended to deliver justice becomes the scene of an execution? To understand the sheer magnitude of the fracture that occurred in the summer of 2011, you first have to understand the environment in which it took place. American Samoa is not a sprawling metropolis defined by anonymity and distance. It is a territory where the Pacific Ocean dictates the boundaries of daily life, a place characterized by tight-knit communities, deep generational ties, and a fundamental reliance on mutual respect. In a community like this, crime is not a distant, abstract concept reported on the evening news. It is personal. Everyone is connected by blood, by marriage, or by a lifetime of shared proximity. The local law enforcement officers are not faceless uniforms. They are neighbors, friends, and trusted community pillars. In such an environment, major violent crime, particularly public, calculated violence, is remarkably rare. It is an aberration that strikes at the very heart of the community's collective sense of security. At the center of this society's legal framework stands the Supreme Court in Fagatogo. It is the highest judicial authority on the island, the ultimate venue where the most significant legal battles are fought and decided. For decades, the Fagatogo courthouse operated under a sense of inherent, almost assumed, safety. The thought that someone would bring lethal violence to the doorstep of the island's highest court was unfathomable. Because of this prevailing atmosphere of communal trust and the historical absence of such brazen attacks, the security protocols at the courthouse in 2011 were relaxed, reflective of a bygone era. Unlike the heavily fortified judicial buildings seen in mainland cities, there were no mandatory, strict metal detectors bottlenecking every entrance. There was a reliance on the deterrent power of the institution itself, the belief that the sheer authority of the Supreme Court would repel any physical threat. This reliance, this vulnerable trust in an unspoken social contract, would prove to be a fatal vulnerability. The date was July 22, 2011. It was a day that began with the mundane rhythm familiar to anyone who works within the legal system. Dockets were being prepared, lawyers were reviewing their notes, and defendants were arriving to face the consequences of their actions. Among the cases scheduled for that period was a high-stakes drug and weapons trial, a case that had demanded significant resources and investigative rigor from the local police force. The man facing these serious charges was Siamo Jr. The name Siamo carried weight on the island. The defendant did not exist in isolation. He was part of a powerful family with a complex web of connections and a deeply rooted presence in the local dynamics. For a man in his position, facing a trial of this magnitude meant facing the complete unraveling of his life and influence. The charges were severe, the evidence was mounting, and the walls of the legal system were closing in. In a situation where most would prepare for a grueling courtroom defense, CMO Jr. recognized a different reality. He understood that the strength of the prosecution's case rested heavily on the shoulders of the investigators who had meticulously built it. If the foundation of the investigation could be destroyed, the entire case might collapse. This brings us to the counterweight of this story, the man who represented the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of criminal power. Detective Mike Tagaloa was not just a police officer. He was a veteran, a Marine Corps leader, and one of the most distinguished and highly respected investigators in the history of the island's police department. Throughout his long and storied career, Detective Tagaloa had been the driving force behind the resolution of numerous major cases. He possessed the rare combination of sharp investigative intuition, unwavering integrity, and deep understanding of the community he swore to protect. He was the kind of officer who commanded respect simply by walking into a room. In the drug and weapons case against CMO Jr., Detective Tagaloa was the lead investigator. He was the architect of the case, the keeper of the evidence, and the primary obstacle standing between the defendant and freedom. For CMO Jr., Detective Tagaloa was not merely an officer of the court. He was a singular, existential threat. The defendant formulated a plan born of desperate, cold-blooded logic. It was not a sudden crime of passion or a panicked reaction to a confrontation. It was a calculated assassination. The logic was chillingly simple. Eliminate the lead investigator, eliminate the primary witness, and you eliminate the case. To execute this plan, CMO Jr. needed access, and he needed a weapon. He exploited the very nature of the Fagatogo courthouse. Knowing that the security screening was lax, knowing that he could walk onto the grounds without facing a rigorous search, he managed to smuggle a handgun into the perimeter of the Supreme Court. Imagine the atmosphere around the courthouse on that morning. It is a place of transit where law enforcement officers, court clerks, judges, and citizens cross paths in the corridors and parking lots. Detective Tagaloa was present, carrying out his duties, likely focused on the procedural steps of the day, preparing to ensure that the work of his department held up under judicial scrutiny. He was in his element, standing on the very ground that was supposed to represent the triumph of his life's work, the delivery of justice. He had spent his life confronting dangerous individuals, dismantling criminal enterprises, and facing down threats, but always with the understanding that there were battlegrounds and there were safe zones. The courthouse was supposed to be the ultimate safe zone. As Detective Tagaloa stood in the hallway and parking area outside the court building, the unthinkable transition from peace to absolute terror occurred in a matter of seconds. CMO Jr., armed and entirely focused on his target, approached the veteran detective. There was no warning, no heated exchange of words to signal the impending violence. The attacker closed the distance, drawing his weapon in the shadow of the Supreme Court. At close range, CMO Jr. opened fire. The sound of gunshots in a courthouse is a profoundly unnatural noise. It is a sound that shatters not just the physical quiet of the morning, but the fundamental psychological foundation of everyone present. It is the sound of the social contract tearing apart. For Detective Tagaloa, despite his decades of tactical experience and combat readiness, the attack was a complete ambush. Struck multiple times in the chest at point-blank range, the esteemed investigator fell. The immediate aftermath was a scene of apocalyptic shock. The Fagatogo courthouse, a place defined by measured voices and strict protocol, instantly descended into pure panic. Court staff, legal professionals, and innocent bystanders scrambled for their lives, diving for cover, unable to comprehend that lethal violence had breached their sanctuary. People who had come to the court to resolve civil disputes, to file paperwork, or to witness the wheels of justice turn, suddenly found themselves in an active war zone, seeking refuge behind desks and walls, praying that the gunfire would not turn toward them. In the chaotic seconds following the execution, the shooter attempted to flee the scene, hoping to capitalize on the sheer terror he had just unleashed. But the police force of American Samoa, though deeply wounded by the sudden and brutal fall of their leader, did not break. Other officers who were present at the courthouse, witnessing the horrific assassination of their revered colleague, immediately abandoned any thought of their own safety. In an extraordinary display of raw courage and instantaneous tactical response, they surged toward the gunfire. They descended upon Siamo Jr., physically overpowering him, wresting the weapon from his grip, and securing him right there on the courthouse grounds. But the victory of the arrest was immediately overshadowed by a devastating reality. On the pavement of the Supreme Court, Detective Mike Tagaloa, the steadfast guardian of the island, was fading. The wounds to his chest were catastrophic. Despite the desperate efforts to save him, the veteran investigator succumbed to his injuries shortly thereafter. The man who had dedicated his life to uncovering the truth and protecting his community had been murdered in the very place where truth and protection are supposed to be guaranteed. The reverberations of this event were immediate and seismic. The island was thrust into a state of red alert. This was no ordinary murder. This was a direct, violent strike against the core of the government and the justice system itself. The death of Detective Tagaloa was a profound, open wound for the law enforcement community, a loss of a mentor, a brother, and a hero. For the public, the illusion of safety had been violently stripped away. If a veteran police commander could be assassinated in broad daylight on the steps of the Supreme Court, what did that mean for the safety of anyone else? This case represents one of the darkest and most unbelievable chapters in the judicial history of American Samoa. It is a story about the devastating intersection of criminal desperation and institutional vulnerability. It forces us to examine the heavy, sometimes fatal price paid by those who stand on the front lines of justice. Today, we will walk through the meticulous details of how a powerful criminal sought to decapitate a major investigation, the tragic fall of a beloved detective, the desperate struggle to secure a shattered courthouse, and the sweeping, historical changes that were born from the ashes of this unparalleled tragedy. We will look at how the justice system, blooded and compromised, had to find a way to heal itself and ensure that the man who brought terror to its doorstep faced the absolute weight of the law he tried to destroy. To truly comprehend the gravity of the collision between these two men, one must first immerse themselves in the unique cultural and geographical tapestry of American Samoa. This is an environment completely unlike the sprawling, anonymous metropolitan centers of the mainland United States. Situated deep in the heart of the South Pacific, the territory is defined by its breathtaking volcanic landscapes, its intense tropical climate, and, most importantly, its incredibly tight-knit social fabric. In a society so geographically isolated, the population operates within an intricate web of generational relationships. Every family lineage is known, every face is familiar, and anonymity is virtually impossible. This profound interconnectedness governs every aspect of daily life. It creates a beautiful, resilient community deeply rooted in tradition and mutual support, but it also creates a unique pressure cooker when it comes to the administration of justice. In a place where everyone knows everyone else, law enforcement is not merely a bureaucratic function. It is a deeply personal endeavor. Police officers police their own neighbors, their extended relatives, and their childhood friends. Maintaining objectivity, enforcing the law without prejudice, and standing against criminal elements requires an extraordinary level of personal integrity and unwavering moral fortitude. Embodying this extraordinary level of integrity was Detective Mike Tagaloa. He was not just a man who wore a badge, he was a foundational pillar of the island's law enforcement community. Long before he navigated the complex criminal underworld of American Samoa, Tagaloa had forged his character in the rigorous, unyielding crucible of the United States Marine Corps. His military service was not merely a chapter in his past. It was the defining architecture of his personality. He brought the core tenets of the Marine Corps back to the shores of his home. Discipline, honor, courage, and an absolute commitment to duty were not just abstract concepts to him. They were the daily operating principles of his life. When he transitioned into civilian law enforcement, he carried that military bearing with him. He was known for a stoic, quiet authority. He did not need to raise his voice to command a room, and he did not rely on intimidation to earn respect. His authority radiated from a deep well of competence and an unshakable belief in right and wrong. Within the police department, Detective Tagaloa was a revered figure. He was the seasoned veteran, the mentor that younger officers looked to for guidance when a case grew cold, when the moral complexities of island policing became overwhelming. He was the lead investigator on the most difficult, the most dangerous, and the most convoluted cases the territory had to offer. His investigative methodology was legendary among his peers. He was methodical, patient, and relentless. He understood that building a case in a community where witnesses were often terrified of retaliation required more than just collecting physical evidence. It required building trust, navigating complex family politics, and ensuring that every single procedural step was executed flawlessly. He specialized in dismantling significant criminal operations, particularly those involving narcotics and illegal firearms, which posed the greatest threat to the peaceful equilibrium of the island. He was the shield standing between the vulnerable citizens of American Samoa and the predatory forces that sought to exploit them. Standing in stark, violent contrast to the unwavering integrity of Detective Tagaloa was the man who would eventually take his life, Siamau Jr. To understand the defendant is to understand the darker, hidden currents of power and influence that can sometimes take root in small, insular communities. Siamau Jr. was not an isolated criminal actor, operating in the shadows without resources. He was a prominent figure within a family that held significant sway, wealth, and complex connections throughout the local area. In a territory where family name and lineage carry immense social weight, the Siamau name commanded a certain type of respect, often heavily laced with fear. This background of privilege and power insulated him from the typical consequences that ordinary citizens might face. He navigated the island with a palpable sense of entitlement, believing that the rules that governed the rest of the population did not necessarily apply to him. Long before the fatal morning at the Supreme Court, Siamau Jr. had established a troubling trajectory. He possessed a documented criminal history, a rap sheet that suggested a pattern of escalating defiance against local authorities. But his latest endeavors had crossed a dangerous threshold. He had moved beyond petty infractions and deeply into the highly lucrative, highly destructive world of narcotics and illegal weaponry. The distribution of illicit drugs and the proliferation of unregistered firearms were cancers eating away at the edges of Samoan society, and Siamau Jr. was actively profiting from that decay. Operating an enterprise of this nature on a small island requires a brazen level of arrogance. It requires the belief that local law enforcement is either too incompetent to uncover the operation or too intimidated by the family's power to do anything about it. This arrogance set him on a direct collision course with Detective Mike Tagaloa. When the intelligence regarding the drug and weapons operation reached the police department, there was only one man equipped to lead the charge. Tagaloa took the case. For months, the veteran detective dedicated his life to unraveling the intricate network Siamau Jr. had built. It was a painstakingly slow process. Tagaloa had to navigate the pervasive culture of silence, convincing terrified informants that he could protect them from the inevitable retaliation of a powerful family. He oversaw the surveillance, he meticulously documented the flow of contraband, and he carefully constructed a chain of evidence that was designed to be absolutely bulletproof. Tagaloa knew exactly who he was dealing with. He understood the societal pressures and the potential dangers of targeting a member of such a connected family. But his military discipline and his fierce love for his community overrode any sense of personal self-preservation. As the investigation culminated, the net finally closed around Siamau Jr. The resulting charges were devastating. This was not a minor possession charge that could be negotiated away or buried in bureaucratic delays. The prosecution, armed with the exhaustive evidence gathered by Detective Tagaloa, presented a case that threatened to permanently dismantle Siamau Jr.'s life. He was facing severe, long-term incarceration. The illusion of his untouchability was shattering before his eyes. The wealth, the family name, and the localized power that had protected him for so long were suddenly proving useless against the crushing weight of the judicial system. As the trial date approached, the psychological landscape of the defendant began to warp under the immense pressure. Siamo Jr. was a man accustomed to control, a man who solved his problems through influence or intimidation. But the legal system, driven by the uncompromising evidence collected by Tagaloa, was an adversary he could not bribe or frighten. Through the discovery process, as his defense attorneys reviewed the prosecution's strategy, one glaring, inescapable fact emerged. The entire foundation of the state's case rested squarely on the shoulders of one man. Detective Mike Tagaloa was not just the lead investigator. He was the primary architect of the impending conviction. He was the central witness who would take the stand, authenticate the evidence, entangle the complex web of the criminal enterprise for the jury, and ultimately seal the defendant's fate. In the desperate, cornered mind of Siamo Jr., a dark and terrifying logic began to take shape. He analyzed his impending destruction and identified the single load-bearing pillar of the prosecution. If the evidence was too strong to refute and the charges too severe to plead down, the only remaining option was to destroy the mechanism of the trial itself. In his twisted calculus, the law was not an abstract, invincible concept. It was embodied in a physical person. If that person ceased to exist, the chain of custody would break, the narrative of the investigation would unravel, and the witnesses, without their protector, would likely disappear back into the shadows. The plan was born not out of a sudden flash of anger, but out of a cold, calculated instinct for survival. He needed to execute a precise strike against the heart of the investigation. This realization transformed the upcoming court proceedings from a legal battle into a theater of war. Siamo Jr. knew the layout of the Fagatogo Supreme Court intimately. He knew the routines of the officers and the flow of civilian traffic. Most importantly, he knew the fatal flaw in the building's defensive perimeter. He knew that the reliance on mutual respect and the historical absence of violence had left the physical security of the courthouse dangerously inadequate. There were no impenetrable checkpoints, no heavily armed guards scrutinizing every individual who walked onto the grounds. It was an open campus, a place designed to welcome the public, completely unprepared for a predator walking among them. As the fateful day in July drew near, the tension on the island was palpable, even if this specific threat remained hidden. Detective Tagaloa continued his preparations, focused entirely on the procedural execution of justice. He was a warrior preparing for a courtroom battle, completely unaware that his adversary had already abandoned the rules of engagement. Tagaloa believed in the sanctity of the court, trusting that the physical boundary of the judicial grounds provided an absolute shield against the violence of the streets. He was preparing his testimony, organizing his files, and readying himself to look the defendant in the eye and deliver the truth. Simultaneously, Siamo Jr. was finalizing a much darker preparation. He was securing the weapon, planning his approach, and mentally steeling himself for the ultimate act of defiance. The trajectory of these two men, one representing the absolute best of the island's dedication to law and order, and the other representing the desperate, violent lengths of criminal entitlement, was locked. The serene, tropical environment of Fagatogo was about to become the backdrop for an unprecedented shattering of peace. The highest court in the land, a monument to reason and law, was completely defenseless against the cold, calculated intent of a man who had decided that the only way to escape justice was to murder it in broad daylight. The morning of July 22nd, 2011, dawned over the island of American Samoa with the familiar, heavy warmth characteristic of the South Pacific summer. The sky above Fagatogo was painted in gentle hues of early light, casting long, soft shadows across the lush volcanic landscape and the deep blue waters of the harbor. At the center of this serene tropical morning stood the Supreme Court building, a structure designed not just as a functional administrative center, but as a physical manifestation of order, reason, and communal stability. As the sun climbed higher, the grounds of the courthouse slowly awakened to the everyday banality of the judicial process. It was a Friday, typically a day filled with the finalization of weekly dockets, the filing of motions, and the anxious anticipation of the weekend. Citizens dressed in their formal attire began to congregate in the parking areas and the wide, open corridors, their conversations a low murmur of legal strategies, family disputes, and neighborhood gossip. Lawyers clutching thick manila folders navigated through the growing crowd, nodding to familiar faces, while court clerks bustled between offices, carrying the endless paperwork that keeps the machinery of justice turning. There was a palpable sense of routine, an unspoken collective assumption that despite the severe nature of the criminal charges often discussed within its walls, the physical space of the courthouse itself was an inviolable sanctuary. Amidst this bustling morning activity walked Detective Mike Tagaloa. He moved with the quiet, unassuming confidence of a man entirely in his element. Dressed with meticulous care, his bearing still subtly reflecting the rigid discipline of his years in the United States Marine Corps, Tagaloa was a familiar and reassuring presence on the court grounds. He was not there to intimidate, but to serve. On this particular morning, his focus was entirely consumed by the impending legal proceedings against Siamao Jr. He was reviewing the chronological sequence of his investigation, mentally rehearsing the timeline of the narcotics network he had spent months dismantling, and preparing himself for the rigorous cross-examination he knew awaited him. For a veteran investigator like Tagaloa, testifying in the Supreme Court was the ultimate culmination of his labor. It was the critical moment where the raw, chaotic reality of the streets was translated into the sterile, undeniable language of evidence and legal precedent. He stood in the transitional space between the parking area and the main entrance corridors, a physical bridge between the outside world and the inner sanctum of the courtroom. Completely absorbed in his professional duties, he was surrounded by colleagues, fellow officers in uniform, and civilian bystanders, entirely enveloped in the false security provided by the institution he had sworn to protect. While Detective Tagaloa prepared to present the truth, a vastly different reality was approaching the courthouse grounds. Siamao Jr. arrived at the Supreme Court not as a defendant seeking a fair trial, but as a predator executing a desperate, premeditated strike. The psychological state of a man preparing to commit an assassination in broad daylight is a complex and terrifying phenomenon. All standard human restraints, all considerations of long-term consequences, and all basic empathy are systematically shut down, replaced by a singular, cold-blooded objective. As Siamao Jr. walked toward the judicial complex, he was carrying a concealed handgun, a deadly mechanism of violence hidden beneath his clothing. The sheer audacity of his plan relied entirely on a critical vulnerability in the local infrastructure. In 2011, the Fagatogo courthouse did not employ the rigid, airport-style security cordons that have become standard in mainland judicial facilities. There were no choke points with sensitive metal detectors, no mandatory bag searches at the perimeter, and no heavily armed sentries checking identifications at the gates. The security protocol was largely based on the honor system and the historical precedent that nobody would dare violate the sacred ground of the Supreme Court. Siamao Jr. weaponized this communal trust. He slipped through the invisible, non-existent barrier, carrying lethal force into a building entirely unprepared to defend against it. The intersection of these two men was not a matter of chance. It was a targeted, deliberate intercept as Siamao Jr. navigated the crowd. His eyes scanned the bustling environment until they locked onto his designated target. Detective Tagaloa was standing in the open area, his attention momentarily diverted by his documents or perhaps a passing conversation with a colleague. He was unarmed in his posture, relaxed, and entirely devoid of any defensive readiness because he was in a place where defense was supposed to be unnecessary. The distance between the predator and the prey closed rapidly. There was no shouted warning, no dramatic confrontation, and no exchange of heated words that might have signaled the impending catastrophe. The attacker did not want to draw attention before the act. He wanted the element of absolute, paralyzing surprise. When Siamao Jr. reached the optimal point-blank range, the transition from normalcy to horror occurred in a fraction of a second. He reached beneath his clothing, smoothly extracting the concealed firearm. The very presence of the weapon in that environment was profoundly unnatural, an alien object of destruction introduced into a space of intellectual argument. Without hesitation, without any visible display of remorse or hesitation, the defendant raised the weapon, leveled it directly at the chest of the veteran detective, and pulled the trigger. The first gunshot tore through the peaceful morning air with a deafening, concussive roar that defied comprehension. It was a sound that did not belong in the Fagatago Supreme Court. It echoed violently off the concrete walls and the pavement, a sharp, mechanical crack of doom that immediately shattered the psychological sanctuary of everyone within earshot. Before the echo of the first shot could even begin to fade, the attacker pulled the trigger again, and then again. Multiple rounds were discharged in rapid, merciless succession, all directed at close range toward the torso of Detective Tagaloa. The physical impact of the projectiles was devastating. The veteran investigator, a man who had survived the rigors of military service and decades of confronting dangerous criminals, was struck with overwhelming, insurmountable force. The ambush was so perfectly executed, so entirely unexpected in its setting, that Tagaloa had absolutely no time to react, to draw his own weapon, or even to raise his hands in a defensive posture. He absorbed the full, lethal trauma of the attack, his body immediately collapsing under the violent kinetic energy of the bullets. As Detective Tagaloa fell to the pavement, a secondary wave of trauma washed over the entire courthouse. The initial split second of stunned silence, where the human brain desperately tries to process an impossible sensory input, gave way to absolute primal pandemonium. The quiet murmurs of legal negotiation were instantly replaced by the terrifying, guttural screams of sheer terror. The crowd of lawyers, clerks, defendants, and innocent civilian bystanders fractured and scattered like shrapnel. Panic, raw and contagious, seized the complex. People threw themselves violently to the ground, scraping their knees and hands on the concrete as they desperately sought any available cover behind parked vehicles, concrete pillars. And decorative planters, briefcases, and legal documents were abandoned in the frantic scramble for survival, pages fluttering into the air and settling on the ground like macabre confetti. The inherent dignity and measured pace of the judicial system evaporated instantly, replaced by a chaotic, desperate stampede driven by the most fundamental human instinct to survive an active shooter situation. In the immediate epicenter of the violence, having delivered the fatal blows, CMO Jr. lowered his weapon and abruptly shifted his focus from assassination to escape. He turned away from the bleeding body of the man he had just shot, intending to utilize the ensuing chaos to slip away from the courthouse grounds and disappear into the island. He believed that the shock and terror he had manufactured would freeze everyone around him, granting him the precious seconds he needed to evade capture. But he had made a catastrophic miscalculation regarding the caliber of the men and women who served alongside Detective Tagaloa. Scattered throughout the immediate vicinity were several other police officers and court security personnel. They had just witnessed the unthinkable, the brutal point-blank execution of their mentor, their brother-in-arms, and one of the most respected figures in their department. While the civilian population understandably fled from the gunfire, the psychological conditioning and the deep, unspoken bond of law enforcement propelled these officers in the opposite direction. They did not freeze, and they did not run for cover. Overcoming the initial shock of the deafening gunshots, they immediately pivoted toward the source of the threat. In an awe-inspiring display of spontaneous, reckless bravery, they charged directly at the armed assailant. CMO Jr. barely had time to register that his escape route was collapsing before the furious response of the police force descended upon him. Multiple officers converged on him simultaneously, hitting him with the combined force of their momentum and their profound outrage. A brutal, desperate physical struggle erupted on the pavement just yards away from where Detective Tagaloa lay mortally wounded. The officers grappled frantically with the shooter, their hands grasping for the deadly firearm, wrestling his arms, and forcing him violently to the ground. It was a chaotic tangle of limbs and uniforms, fueled by the adrenaline of a life-or-death confrontation. Despite his desperation, The assailant was completely overwhelmed by the sheer, unyielding force of the responding officers. They viciously tore the weapon from his grasp, rendering it safe, and pinned him to the concrete with a weight that ensured he could not move a single muscle. Handcuffs were rapidly and forcefully ratcheted onto his wrists, definitively neutralizing the immediate threat and concluding the act of violence. However, the rapid and heroic apprehension of the shooter provided absolutely no comfort, because the true tragedy was already unfolding on the ground a few feet away. Other officers and bystanders desperately rushed to the side of Detective Mike Tagaloa. The scene was heartbreaking. The veteran officer, who had stood as an immovable pillar of strength for the community just moments before, was now lying on his back, his uniform rapidly absorbing the catastrophic bleeding from multiple chest wounds. The frantic efforts to save his life began immediately. Hands pressed desperately against the gunshot wounds, trying to stem the relentless flow of blood, while voices shouted frantically into police radios, screaming for emergency medical services to rush to the Supreme Court. The air was thick with the smell of discharged gunpowder, the metallic scent of blood, and the agonizing sounds of collective grief. Despite the frantic, desperate attempts to administer first aid, the reality of the injuries was undeniable. The bullets had struck vital organs, causing massive internal damage that simply could not be reversed on the pavement of the Fagatogo courthouse. As the sirens of approaching ambulances began to wail in the distance, cutting through the heavy morning air, the life of Detective Tagaloa slowly and tragically slipped away. He was surrounded by the men he had trained, on the grounds of the institution he had dedicated his life to serving, stolen from his family and his island by an act of incomprehensible cowardice. The sanctuary of the Supreme Court had been breached, permanently stained with the blood of a hero, leaving the entire territory of American Samoa to grapple with a profound, irreplaceable loss and a terrifying new reality. The immediate aftermath of a homicide is typically characterized by a sudden, clinical shift in the atmosphere. The chaos of the violent act is rapidly replaced by the methodical, almost sterile procedures of crime scene preservation. Yellow tape is unfurled, defining the boundaries of the tragedy. Evidence markers are meticulously placed beside spent shell casings, and the area is secured against any potential contamination. But the crime scene that materialized on the grounds of the Fagatogo Supreme Court on that July morning defied all standard clinical detachment. The officers tasked with securing the perimeter, photographing the blood spatter, and cataloging the physical evidence were not processing a stranger. They were documenting the brutal assassination of their mentor, their commanding officer, and the very man who had taught them the rigorous protocols they were now forced to employ. The emotional toll of this undertaking was incomprehensible. Every photograph taken of the pavement, every measurement recorded of the bullet trajectories, was a heartbreaking confrontation with their own profound loss. Yet, despite the overwhelming grief that permeated the heavy tropical air, the law enforcement officers of American Samoa demonstrated an extraordinary level of professionalism. They understood that the most profound way to honor Detective Mike Tagaloa was to ensure that the investigation into his murder was absolutely flawless, leaving not a single microscopic detail to chance or interpretation. The physical evidence at the immediate scene was indisputable. The murder weapon, the handgun, violently wrestled from the grasp of Siamo Jr. Mere seconds after the fatal shots were fired, was carefully secured in an evidence bag. The spent shell casings, scattered across the concrete, provided a grim, undeniable map of the shooter's position and the rapid succession of the gunfire. The sheer proximity of the attack left forensic evidence that was impossible to refute. But establishing the identity of the shooter was only the first, most superficial layer of the investigation. In the eyes of the law, a successful prosecution for first-degree murder requires far more than just proving who pulled the trigger. It demands the definitive establishment of premeditation, the chilling proof that the act of violence was not a spontaneous crime of passion or a panicked reaction, but a cold, calculated, and deliberate execution. To build this impenetrable case, The investigative team had to pivot away from the physical bloodstains on the courthouse steps and delve deep into the psychological landscape and the criminal entanglements of the man. Sitting in their interrogation room, transporting the suspect from the shattered grounds of the Supreme Court to the police precinct was an exercise in extreme, agonizing restraint. The officers in the vehicle were acutely aware that the man restrained in the backseat was entirely responsible for the death of their most revered colleague. The tension within the confined space of the patrol car was suffocating, yet the officers maintained their strict adherence to procedure, ensuring the suspect's rights were not violated in any capacity, knowing that any procedural misstep could potentially jeopardize the entire prosecution. Upon arrival at the station, CMO Jr. was placed in an isolated interrogation room. The dynamic within that room was incredibly complex. The detectives tasked with interviewing him were not facing an erratic, disorganized street-level criminal. They were facing a man from a prominent family, an individual who had operated a sophisticated illicit enterprise and who clearly possessed a chilling capacity for lethal violence. The investigators had to suppress their own profound anger and approach the interrogation with icy, unwavering objectivity. They meticulously documented his demeanor, noting the profound absence of any frantic panic or remorse that typically follows a spontaneous, unplanned crime. His posture, his silence, and his overall disposition pointed toward a terrifying reality. This was a man who had executed a plan, and even in handcuffs, he seemed to harbor a twisted belief that his horrific gambit might actually work to erase his legal troubles. To dismantle this delusion and expose the absolute depths of his premeditation, the investigative team had to meticulously dissect the motive. The path to understanding the assassination of Detective Tagaloa led directly to the very desk the fallen officer had occupied just hours before. The investigators opened the extensive files of the narcotics and illegal weapons case that CMO Jr. had been facing. It was in these meticulously organized documents that the true brilliance of Detective Tagaloa was fully revealed, and the grim catalyst for his murder was completely laid bare. As the detectives reviewed the surveillance logs, the informant testimonies, and the detailed chain of custody for the seized contraband, they realized the sheer magnitude of the corner into which the defendant had been backed. Tagaloa had not just built a case, he had constructed an inescapable fortress of evidence. The documentation proved that the defendant's illicit empire was fully compromised. The charges were ironclad, the evidence was overwhelming, and the impending prison sentence was incredibly severe. This deep dive into the underlying criminal case provided the critical narrative of premeditation. The investigators pieced together the desperate, sociopathic logic that had consumed the defendant in the weeks leading up to the shooting. The impending trial was no longer just a legal proceeding for CMO Jr. It was an existential threat to his freedom and his entrenched status on the island. The files confirmed that Detective Tagaloa was not merely a peripheral figure in the prosecution. He was the central, load-bearing pillar. He was the primary witness whose testimony would validate every single piece of evidence and dismantle any potential defense strategy the expensive lawyers might mount. The investigation definitively established that the defendant had reviewed the state's evidence during the legal discovery process and reached a fatal conclusion. He realized that as long as Tagaloa was alive to take the stand, a conviction was a mathematical certainty. Therefore, the murder was not an act of blind rage, but a tactical, albeit horrific, maneuver deliberately designed to decapitate the prosecution and force the complete collapse of the trial. Confirming this motive required the investigators to explicitly retrace the suspect's steps in the days and hours leading up to the shooting. They had to establish exactly how a man facing serious criminal charges had managed to acquire a lethal weapon and bring it onto the grounds of the highest court in the territory. This phase of the investigation forced the department to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality regarding the institutional security of the island. The detectives interviewed the court staff, the security personnel, and the various individuals who had been present in the corridors that morning. Through these painstaking interviews, a clear and agonizing picture emerged. There was no elaborate breach, no sophisticated bypassing of security checkpoints, and no inside accomplice. The defendant simply walked onto the grounds, exploiting the historical reliance on mutual respect and the tragic absence of physical screening measures like metal detectors at the public entrances. The weapon had been concealed, carried past the invisible boundaries of the judicial sanctuary, entirely undetected until the exact moment it was drawn. The investigation proved that the shooter had stalked his target, waiting for the precise moment when the detective was most vulnerable. Distracted by his professional duties and entirely unaware of the lethal threat lurking in the open space, the witness testimonies gathered by the investigative team were instrumental in sealing the case for first-degree murder. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the bystanders was immense, but their accounts were incredibly consistent and devastating for the defense. Dozens of individuals, ranging from seasoned legal professionals to terrified civilian bystanders, provided sworn statements detailing the exact sequence of events. They confirmed that there was absolutely no preceding altercation between the two men. There was no argument, no aggressive posture from the detective, and no scenario that could even remotely be twisted into a claim of self-defense or provocation. The witnesses described a cold, calculated approach followed immediately by a merciless execution. They detailed how the shooter stood in front of his victim, discharging multiple rounds at close range with an unmistakable intent to kill. These civilian accounts, combined with the physical ballistics evidence and the heavily documented motive, created an evidentiary chain that was absolutely unbreakable. As the days passed and the investigation culminated, the sheer volume of proof amassed against Siamo Jr. became monumental. The investigative team had successfully channeled their profound grief into an investigative masterclass. They had secured the murder weapon, matched the ballistics to the fatal wounds with scientific certainty, documented the precise timeline of the attack through corroborated witness statements, and exhaustively established the premeditated motive by exposing the underlying narcotics case. They had mapped out a timeline of cold-blooded intent that stretched from the realization of his impending legal doom to the exact moment he pulled the trigger on the courthouse steps. Every single page of the final investigative dossier represented a sacred promise kept to the fallen detective. The officers who compiled the statements, the technicians who processed the evidence, and the detectives who painstakingly reconstructed the timeline all worked with a singular, unyielding purpose. They knew the defense might attempt to leverage the defendant's prominent family background to reduce the severity of the charges. To preempt any such maneuvers, the investigation was subjected to multiple layers of rigorous internal review, ensuring the constitutional rights of the accused were flawlessly respected, paradoxically ensuring his conviction would be immune to any appellate technicalities. When the complete file was finally handed over to the prosecuting attorneys, it carried the collective weight of a traumatized island and a devastated police department. The investigation had achieved its ultimate goal. It ensured that the horrific gamble taken by the defendant would fail absolutely. He had murdered the lead investigator hoping to destroy the case against him, but his actions only guaranteed his permanent removal from society. The evidence gathered by Tagaloa's colleagues ensured that the fallen detective's final case would be the most robust and heavily fortified prosecution in the history of the territory. The stage was meticulously set for the judicial system, blooded but unbowed, to exact its uncompromising retribution. The courtroom, the very space the killer had sought to desecrate with violence, would now become the sterile, procedural arena where the overwhelming weight of this flawless investigation would crush his remaining freedom forever. The transition from the chaotic crime scene to the structured environment of the courtroom marks a profound shift in the narrative of justice. When the trial of the defendant finally commenced, the atmosphere within the judicial complex was fundamentally altered, bearing no resemblance to the relaxed, communal environment that had existed on the morning of July 22nd. The building itself had been transformed into a formidable fortress. The very institution that the defendant had sought to violently dismantle was now asserting its absolute authority, heavily fortified by an unprecedented law enforcement presence. Every entrance was meticulously guarded. Every individual entering the gallery was subjected to intense scrutiny, and the air within the courtroom was thick with an inescapable, suffocating tension. This was not a standard legal proceeding. It was a deeply personal reckoning for the entire territory of American Samoa. The community had gathered not just to witness a trial, but to see if the foundational architecture of their society could withstand the catastrophic blow it had been dealt. The defendant was escorted into this highly secure environment under maximum restraint, a stark contrast to the arrogant, untouchable persona he had once projected across the island. He was no longer a powerful figure operating above the law. He was entirely enveloped by it, forced to sit silently and face the overwhelming, meticulously assembled machinery of the state's prosecution. The prosecution's legal strategy was a masterclass in objective, relentless storytelling driven by a profound sense of duty to their fallen colleague. The prosecuting attorneys understood that they were carrying the emotional weight of a traumatized police department and a grieving community. But they also knew that yielding to that emotion in front of a jury could be procedurally fatal. They had to present the assassination of Detective Mike Tagaloa not merely as an immense tragedy, but as a calculated, first-degree, premeditated murder. In their opening arguments, presented with clinical precision and undeniable gravity, they laid out the structural thesis of their case. They painted a vivid, chilling portrait of a man who found himself trapped by the sheer competence of a veteran investigator and who subsequently chose to execute a targeted strike against the justice system itself. The state painstakingly explained that the violence on the courthouse steps was not a spontaneous eruption of rage, nor was it the desperate panic of a cornered man in the heat of the moment. Instead, they framed it as a deliberate, methodical, and deeply cynical maneuver engineered to destroy the central pillar of an ongoing criminal prosecution. This framework of calculated intent was the cornerstone of the first-degree murder charge, and proving it required taking the jury on a dark, undeniable journey into the defendant's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the assassination. To firmly establish this chilling motive, the prosecution executed a profound and poetic legal maneuver. They brought the spirit of Detective Tagaloa into the courtroom by presenting the very evidence he had sacrificed his life to collect. The underlying narcotics and illegal weapons investigation, the exact case that the defendant had tried so desperately to obliterate, became the primary weapon used against him. The state meticulously unveiled the extensive surveillance logs, the informant reports, and the exhaustive chain of custody documents that the veteran investigator had compiled over months of dangerous, painstaking work. As this evidence was methodically introduced to the court, the brilliance and unwavering dedication of the fallen detective shone brightly, illuminating the exact reason why he had been targeted for elimination. The prosecution demonstrated to the jury that the defendant had reviewed this devastating cache of evidence during the pretrial discovery phase and had realized the absolute impossibility of mounting a successful legal defense. The jury was made to understand the stark, mathematical certainty of the defendant's logic. He knew that as long as the lead investigator was alive to take the stand and authenticate the complex web of the criminal enterprise, a severe and lengthy prison sentence was inescapable. By introducing the murdered detective's final, flawless investigation, the prosecution definitively proved that the assassination was a direct, premeditated response to the uncompromising integrity of the victim. Once the motive was deeply entrenched in the minds of the jury, the trial transitioned to the horrifying reality of the physical act itself. The prosecution called upon the witnesses who had been present on the grounds of the Fagatago Supreme Court on that fateful July morning. One by one, court clerks, legal professionals, and civilian bystanders took the stand, their testimonies weaving a consistent, devastating tapestry of sudden, unprovoked violence. These individuals, still bearing the psychological scars of the trauma they had endured, recounted the horrific sequence of events with harrowing clarity. They detailed the serene, routine atmosphere of the morning, abruptly shattered by the deafening roar of gunfire. They testified unequivocally that there had been no argument, no confrontation, and absolutely no threatening behavior from the veteran detective. Their sworn accounts painted a terrifying picture of the defendant approaching his target with cold, predatory focus, drawing a concealed weapon, and discharging multiple rounds at point-blank range into the chest of an unsuspecting, unarmed man. These eyewitness testimonies were systematically reinforced by the presentation of the physical and ballistic evidence. Forensic experts meticulously linked the spent shell casings recovered from the courthouse pavement directly to the handgun that had been violently wrestled from the defendant's grip by the heroic responding officers. The scientific certainty of the ballistics, combined with the traumatized yet unwavering accounts of the eyewitnesses, created an evidentiary fortress that was absolutely impenetrable. Faced with this overwhelming avalanche of proof, the defense found itself navigating an entirely impossible legal landscape. There was no plausible alternative narrative to offer, no reasonable doubt to inject into the minds of the jury, and no procedural loophole left unsealed by the flawless investigation of the local police department. The traditional strategies employed in major criminal trials were rendered completely useless by the sheer, brutal transparency of the act. They could not argue a case of mistaken identity, for the defendant had been apprehended directly on the scene, the murder weapon still hot in his hands, pinned to the concrete by multiple officers who had witnessed the immediate aftermath of the shooting. They could not successfully argue self-defense, as dozens of witnesses had explicitly confirmed the unprovoked, ambush-style nature of the attack against an officer who had no opportunity to even reach for his own weapon. Any attempt to minimize the premeditation was completely crushed by the prosecution's masterful integration of the underlying narcotics case, which proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant possessed a clear, calculated, and desperate reason to eliminate the detective. The defense was reduced to a state of procedural participation, merely ensuring that the defendant's constitutional rights were maintained throughout the proceedings, while powerlessly watching the state systematically and definitively dismantle his freedom. The man who had once wielded significant power and influence on the island was now a silent, defeated spectator to his own inescapable legal doom. After days of absorbing the heavy, unyielding presentation of facts, the trial reached its inevitable conclusion. The prosecution delivered their closing arguments, summarizing the meticulous timeline of the premeditated assassination, reminding the court of the devastating loss suffered by the community, and demanding that the ultimate price be paid for the ultimate violation of the law. The jury was subsequently sequestered to deliberate, tasked with weighing the monumental volume of evidence against the severe charges presented. In cases featuring such overwhelming, corroborated proof, the period of deliberation is often more a matter of procedural formality than genuine debate. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the heavy silence that fell over the gallery was thick with anticipation and unresolved grief. The verdict, when it was finally entered into the official record, resonated through the fortified walls of the courthouse with a profound sense of finality. The jury found the defendant guilty on all counts, including the most severe charge of first-degree murder, as well as multiple associated firearms violations. The pronouncement of guilt was a moment of immense, complex emotional release for the law enforcement community and the family of the fallen detective. It did not erase the agonizing pain of their loss, nor did it bring back the man who had dedicated his life to their protection, but it provided the absolute, undeniable validation that the system he had died defending had ultimately prevailed against the forces of violent chaos. The final phase of the judicial process, the sentencing hearing, served as the ultimate punctuation mark on this tragic chapter of American Samoan history. It was the moment where the abstract concept of justice was translated into a concrete, permanent reality for the convicted murderer. The presiding judge, carrying the solemn responsibility of addressing an unprecedented attack on the institution of the court itself, delivered a sentence that reflected the absolute maximum severity permissible under the law. The judge articulated the profound depravity of the crime, noting that the assassination of a police officer on the steps of the Supreme Court was not merely an attack on an individual, but a direct, unforgivable assault on the very foundation of civilization and the rule of law on the island. Consequently, the defendant was sentenced to spend the remainder of his natural life in a maximum security penitentiary, completely stripped of any future possibility of parole, bail, or early release. The sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole was absolute and irrevocable. It ensured that the man who had arrogantly believed he could murder his way out of a legal predicament would instead be permanently erased from the society he had sought to terrorize. As the heavily guarded doors of the courtroom closed behind the condemned man for the final time, the legal battle concluded, leaving behind a scarred but victorious justice system, and setting the stage for a monumental period of institutional reflection and sweeping, permanent change across the territory. The conclusion of a trial, no matter how definitive the verdict or how severe the sentencing, is rarely the true end of the story in the eyes of a community that has been fundamentally shattered. When the courtroom doors finally closed on the man responsible for the assassination of Detective Mike Tagaloa, the legal chapter of the case was finished, but the deep, existential transformation of American Samoa had only just begun. The tragedy was not merely a singular, horrific event. It was a profound rupture in the social and institutional contract that had held the territory together for generations. The murder of a veteran investigator in the very heart of the highest judicial authority on the island served as a violent, irreversible wake-up call, forcing a small, tight-knit society to confront the reality that the safety they had long taken for granted was, in fact, an illusion. The price of this awakening was the life of a hero, a loss that resonated through the police department, the judiciary, and the families of every citizen who suddenly realized that the world had changed around them. This period of aftermath, characterized by immense communal grief and a rigorous, systemic overhaul, remains one of the most critical eras in the history of the territory's law enforcement and judicial evolution. For the men and women of the local police force, the loss of Detective Tagaloa was a trauma that transcended their professional duties. He was not just a supervisor or a lead investigator. He was a mentor who had shaped the careers of countless officers, a reliable partner in the most dangerous of circumstances, and a symbol of the unwavering moral integrity required to police their own community. The brutality of his death, perpetrated by a member of a prominent family on the very ground where he performed his service, left a void that could never truly be filled. In the weeks and months following the murder, the department was forced to undergo a period of intense, painful reflection. They were tasked with reconciling their deep personal heartbreak with the requirement to continue serving the public. The professional standard they maintained throughout the investigation and the subsequent trial was a testament to the culture Tagaloa had helped build, but the internal cost was profound. Officers who had grown accustomed to a level of relative ease in their daily interactions with the public were now forced to operate with a new, heightened level of tactical caution, a shift that fundamentally altered the psychological environment of law enforcement on the island. The most visible and immediate impact of the tragedy was the radical, sweeping reform of the judicial infrastructure. The Fagatago Supreme Court, which had previously operated under the archaic, almost quaint assumption that the sanctity of the institution itself was a sufficient deterrent against violence, was fundamentally redesigned. The historical absence of rigorous security, which had been exploited with such lethal efficiency by the assassin, was replaced by a comprehensive, mandatory, and highly visible security apparatus. The changes were not merely decorative, they were structural and absolute. Every entry point into the courthouse was retrofitted with state-of-the-art metal detection technology, and the days of unrestricted access for the general public were permanently brought to an end. A specialized force of court security personnel, trained in modern threat assessment and active shooter response, became a permanent, armed presence within the building. The courthouse, once an open, inviting symbol of communal trust, was transformed into a secure facility designed to protect the integrity of the judicial process against any potential future threat. This, however, was not just a logistical change, it was a psychological milestone. A silent acknowledgement that the vulnerability which had permitted the murder of Detective Tagaloa was a ghost of the past that would never be allowed to haunt the institution again. This institutional hardening extended far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The entire territory of American Samoa began a broader, more uncomfortable conversation about the nature of crime, the influence of powerful family names on the administration of justice, and the evolving challenges of maintaining law and order in a small, insular society. The trial of the assassin had exposed a dangerous intersection of criminal entitlement and institutional vulnerability, prompting a public discourse that was as difficult as it was necessary. There was a renewed focus on the eradication of the narcotics and illegal weapons networks that had been the primary catalyst for the violence. The police department, fueled by the memory of their fallen leader, adopted a significantly more aggressive and proactive stance toward dismantling organized criminal activity. The community, for its part, began to shift away from the reflexive desire to protect or overlook the transgressions of connected individuals, recognizing that the price of such silence could be the life of a public servant. It was a slow, painful process of cultural adjustment, but it was spurred by the undeniable, blood-stained reality that the old ways of navigating social power dynamics were no longer sustainable in a modern, dangerous world. Looking back at the trajectory of this tragedy, it becomes clear that the impact of the murder of Detective Tagaloa was not limited to the legislative and security changes that followed. The most lasting consequence was the elevation of the detective to the status of a permanent, revered martyr of justice. His life became a foundational narrative for new recruits entering the police department, a standard by which all future investigators were measured. His unwavering commitment to the truth, even in the face of insurmountable pressure and fatal danger, serves as an eternal beacon for the ethical responsibilities of law enforcement. In a world where the complexities of justice often become muddied by procedural gray areas and the temptations of power, the story of Detective Tagaloa remains a stark, clear, and sobering reminder of the absolute cost of integrity. He stands as a representation of what it means to be a true protector, a man who, until his very last breath, refused to compromise his duty, even when the person standing in front of him held a gun to his heart. His story is not just a tale of criminal violence. It is a profound, albeit tragic, testament to the endurance of the rule of law in a society that had to look into the abyss to find the strength to save itself. The legacy of the Fagatogo courthouse murder is thus both an institutional and a personal one. The physical security measures are a daily, tactile reminder of the vulnerability the island once lived with, serving as a silent sentinel that prevents the repetition of history. But the deeper, spiritual legacy is found in the renewed determination of those who continue the work that Detective Tagaloa started. The legal system in American Samoa today is fundamentally stronger, more objective, and more resilient than it was before July 2011. It has been tested by the most extreme circumstances possible and has emerged with an uncompromising dedication to accountability. While the pain of his death has dimmed over the years, the lessons learned from the investigation and the subsequent judicial victory remain etched into the collective consciousness of the territory. The killer's attempt to destroy the case against him by murdering its architect proved to be a failure of monumental proportions, instead of erasing the evidence. His actions only ensured its immortality and solidified the conviction he had desperately tried to escape. Ultimately, this case serves as a dark mirror for any society that places its trust in the fragile structures of the law. It forces us to acknowledge that institutions are not invincible. They are only as strong as the people who serve within them and the collective resolve of the community to defend them. The tragedy in Fagatogo was a moment where the thin, invisible line that keeps civilization from collapsing into chaos was tested and, ultimately, held firm. Though the cost of that stability was the life of an extraordinary man. As we reflect on this profound chapter of true crime, we are compelled to honor the memory of Detective Mike Tagaloa not by dwelling on the graphic details of his death, but by recognizing the immense value of the life he lived and the principles he died to uphold. The case is a grim reminder that justice is not a guaranteed, self-sustaining process. It is a fragile, noble pursuit that requires constant vigilance, unwavering courage, and the periodic, oft and painful, reminder that its existence is earned by those who stand in its defense. In the quiet, hardened corridors of the Fagatogo courthouse, the presence of the veteran investigator remains a guiding spirit, a symbol of the highest standard of public service that continues to resonate long after the sirens have silenced and the trial has reached its end. The shadow cast by the events of July 22nd 2011 extends far beyond the confines of the Fagatogo courthouse and the immediate borders of American Samoa. When we examine the tapestry of true crime, we often look for patterns, for lessons that can be extrapolated to the broader human condition. The murder of Detective Mike Tagaloa is not merely a regional tragedy. It is a profound case study in the anatomy of institutional vulnerability and the terrifying resilience required to rectify a total collapse of security. As we conclude this deep exploration into one of the most significant judicial crises in Pacific history, we are left with the task of synthesizing what this narrative reveals about the delicate nature of the social contract. It is a story that forces us to question the inherent safety of our public spaces, the true cost of corruption when it intersects with systemic power, and the terrifying speed at which an orderly society can be destabilized when a predator decides to target the mechanisms of accountability itself. The institutional legacy of this case is found in the fundamental reevaluation of what constitutes a protected environment. Before the shooting, the Fagatogo Supreme Court existed in a state of what we might call historical innocence. The assumption of safety was not based on tactical assessment or threat modeling. It was based on the belief that the authority of the court was, in and of itself, a sufficient barrier against the darker impulses of the criminal element. This is a recurring vulnerability in many communities worldwide, where the respect for institutional power masks the reality that legal authority is, in the end, only as potent as the physical security that surrounds it. The assassin's ability to bypass all defenses and execute an investigator in the very heart of the judiciary serves as a permanent, chilling warning against the dangers of complacency. Any institution that operates in the public eye must constantly audit its own vulnerabilities, accepting that the very nature of its mission makes it a target for those who seek to undermine it. The post-tragedy transformation of the courthouse into a high-security facility was not an act of cynicism, but an act of maturity. It represented a collective acknowledgement that the sanctuary of justice is not a natural occurrence. It is a manufactured state of security that requires perpetual vigilance, advanced technology, and a dedicated, armed presence to remain intact. Beyond the physical fortifications, the case forces us to reckon with the complex role of the lead investigator in the modern criminal trial. Detective Tagaloa was not merely a law enforcement officer. He was the primary witness and the architectural linchpin of a complex, high-stakes prosecution. The murderer identified this reality with terrifying clarity, correctly surmising that the defendant's freedom was tied entirely to the detective's participation in the legal process. This dynamic highlights a systemic fragility when the entire weight of a complex criminal case rests upon the physical presence and testimony of a single individual. That individual becomes an existential threat to the defendant. While modern legal systems have developed various protocols for witness protection and the preservation of testimony, the fundamental reality remains that a sufficiently motivated and sufficiently dangerous criminal may view the investigator not as a participant in a legal debate, but as a combatant in a physical war. The assassination of Tagaloa remains a haunting reminder that in the world of high-stakes narcotics and organized crime, the investigator stands on the front line of a very real, very lethal struggle. And the institutional support provided to them must be commensurate with that level of danger. The psychological impact on the community of American Samoa serves as a reminder of the fragility of collective trust. In a society where family and lineage are central to the social fabric, the realization that one of their own had been betrayed by such a calculated, cold-blooded act of violence from within their own ranks was profoundly destabilizing. It required the community to move beyond the traditional dynamics of protecting their own and to embrace the harder, more abstract concept of equal justice under the law, regardless of family name or status. The trial, therefore, was not just a pursuit of a murderer. It was an affirmation of a new societal standard, one where the power of the family name was completely neutralized by the evidentiary requirements of the state. The fact that the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, including the most severe of charges, was the final, critical step in this societal maturation. It signaled that the island had collectively decided that the rule of law was not an optional framework to be navigated by the privileged, but an absolute, immutable standard that applied to every individual, without exception. Furthermore, we must address the role of the responding officers who, despite the visceral shock of witnessing the execution of their peer, successfully apprehended the shooter. Their actions are the silent, often overlooked heroes of this narrative. In the immediate seconds following the gunfire, they had two choices: succumb to the natural, evolutionary instinct to seek cover and prioritize their own survival, or to override that instinct and engage a lethal, unpredictable threat. By choosing the latter, they prevented a scenario that could have easily spiraled into a much wider, more chaotic event. Their bravery was not the result of a long, tactical debate. It was the manifestation of a deep-seated professional ethos, the very same ethos that Detective Tagaloa had embodied throughout his life. Their actions served to validate the existence of the very justice system they were sworn to protect. They demonstrated that the law is not just a set of documents or a building, but a human commitment that is upheld by the actions of those who serve it, often at the risk of their own lives. The life and death of Detective Mike Tagaloa have become woven into the history of American Samoa, serving as a permanent, bittersweet reminder of the cost of public service. His memory is honored not just in official ceremonies or memorials, but in the everyday, rigorous standard of law enforcement that defines the territory today. Every officer who walks into the courthouse, every investigator who builds a case against a criminal enterprise, and every prosecutor who stands before a judge carries the weight of that legacy. They know that they are part of a lineage that was tempered in fire and that their commitment to the truth is the most fitting monument to the man who gave everything to protect that truth. The case remains a beacon of light in the darkness for any law enforcement professional facing the daunting challenges of an organized criminal adversary. It is a reminder that while the path of integrity is fraught with danger, it is the only path that ultimately leads to justice. As we close this chapter, we are left to ponder the nature of evil and the nature of the systems we build to contain it. The perpetrator of this crime sought to use violence to subvert the process, to break the chain of evidence, and to rewrite his own destiny. He believed that he could operate outside the constraints of the law, that his personal will was stronger than the institutional will of the state. He was wrong. The history of the case is a testament to the fact that when the institutions of justice are properly supported, when the investigations are conducted with professional excellence, and when the community refuses to be intimidated by the shadow of the criminal element, the system holds. The law is not a rigid, unyielding force, but a resilient, adaptable human construct that gains its strength from the courage of those who refuse to yield. Ultimately, this story is a mirror. It forces us to ask ourselves if we are doing enough to support those who stand on the front lines of our own justice systems. It asks us if we have allowed our own institutions to become complacent, to believe in a false security, and to forget that the peace we enjoy is a fragile, hard-won commodity. The Fagatogo Courthouse stands today as a testament to the sacrifice of Detective Mike Tagaloa, a physical space that has been transformed by his loss. It is a place where the memory of the past informs the security of the present, ensuring that the work of justice can continue, uninterrupted and protected. The story of this murder will continue to be told, not as a celebration of the crime, but as a reflection on the man whose life and death helped define the modern era of the island's judicial history. It is a story of profound tragedy, yes, but it is also a story of a system that refused to break, a police department that refused to falter, and a society that decided to confront its darkest moment and emerge on the other side as a stronger, more just, and more secure community. The legacy of Detective Tagaloa is not in the bullet that ended his life, but in the thousands of lives that have been protected and the justice that has been served in the decades since that terrible morning. It is a legacy of resilience, of duty, and of the unwavering belief that no matter how dark the shadows may grow, the light of the law will ultimately prevail. The echo of the tragic events at the Fagatogo Supreme Court continued to ripple through the fabric of American Samoan society long after the final verdict was rendered and the prison doors slammed shut on the assailant. This case became more than a mere record in a criminal database. It evolved into a cautionary epic, a profound cultural touchstone that redefined the collective understanding of public duty, institutional vulnerability, and the true cost of maintaining the rule of law. When we reflect upon the broader implications of the assassination of Detective Mike Tagaloa, we find that his death served as a harsh, irreversible catalyst for a societal awakening. The island, previously defined by its reliance on intimate knowledge and mutual trust, had to undergo a painful metamorphosis to survive in an era where such trust could be weaponized by those with malicious intent. This transformation was not merely bureaucratic. It was deeply psychological, as every citizen, public servant, and government official was forced to reconcile the idyllic peace of their home with the chilling, lethal reality of what had transpired on the courthouse steps. One of the most enduring lessons from this tragedy is the fragility of the social contract within insular communities. In places where every person is known, the threat of violence is often diminished by the prospect of social shaming and the strength of communal bonds. However, this structure creates a unique blind spot, the belief that one's own community is somehow immune to the predatory, calculated violence found in larger, more anonymous settings. The murder of Detective Tagaloa shattered this illusion with a violence so abrupt and so public that it was impossible to ignore or justify. The assassin exploited this specific cultural vulnerability, banking on the idea that the community's collective disbelief would provide him the necessary window to commit his crime and then slip away unnoticed. The failure of that plan, brought about by the immediate and heroic intervention of the victim's colleagues, remains the most significant counter-narrative to the initial tragedy. It proved that while an institution might be vulnerable, the human beings operating within that institution are capable of an extraordinary, spontaneous courage that can overcome even the most desperate, premeditated threats. The ongoing legacy of the case is fundamentally tied to the way the law enforcement community in American Samoa processes trauma and builds resilience. Following the incident, the training protocols for police officers across the territory were significantly modernized and intensified. There was a conscious pivot toward integrating tactical awareness, active shooter response, and threat assessment into the daily culture of the department. This was not a move toward authoritarianism, but toward an enlightened sense of duty, acknowledging that the best way to protect the community is to be fully prepared for the darkest contingencies. Every new officer who joins the force is taught the story of Detective Tagaloa not as a lesson in despair, but as a standard for excellence. They learn of his unwavering commitment to the investigation, his professional rigor in the face of immense pressure, and his ultimate sacrifice. His memory has become a foundational element of the departmental identity, a touchstone of integrity that guides the ethical choices of those who follow in his footsteps. In this way, his influence continues to permeate the investigations of today, ensuring that the work of justice is conducted with the same meticulous, uncompromising spirit he brought to every case. Furthermore, the reform of the judicial infrastructure serves as a permanent, physical reminder of the lessons learned during that horrific summer. The modernization of the Fagatogo courthouse, with its comprehensive security measures and restricted access, is a testament to the fact that security is an active, ongoing responsibility rather than a passive, inherent state. These systems are not designed to create a barrier between the government and the people it serves, but to preserve the integrity of the judicial process by creating a secure space where facts can be presented without fear or the threat of violence. The public has come to accept these measures as a necessary evolution of their government, recognizing that the safety of the institution is an essential prerequisite for the liberty of the individual. This transition from a culture of assumed safety to a culture of defended sanctuary is perhaps the most significant structural change in the history of the island's judiciary. It is a change that speaks to the resilience of society that refused to be cowed by a single act of cowardice and chose instead to build a stronger, more secure framework for the future. The broader societal conversation sparked by the assassination has also had a lasting impact on how the community approaches the issue of power and influence. The fact that the assassin came from a prominent family and sought to use that influence as a shield against the law brought long-standing, often unspoken, dynamics into the light of public scrutiny. The subsequent trial, which stripped away the armor of privilege and subjected the defendant to the unvarnished, unrelenting weight of evidence, sent a powerful, unmistakable message across the island: no name, no lineage, and no amount of local influence can stand above the impartial, objective reach of the law. This was a critical turning point for the territory's democratic character. It reaffirmed that justice is not a commodity to be bargained with or an asset to be controlled, but a foundational promise that the government owes to every citizen equally. The communal rejection of the killer's entitlement was a vital act of self-preservation, a sign that the society was evolving toward a more equitable and transparent future, even if that evolution was born from the trauma of an unacceptable tragedy. As we look at the case from the vantage point of the present day, we see a story that is both deeply specific to the geography and culture of American Samoa and, simultaneously, universal in its lessons. It is a story about the absolute necessity of maintaining the integrity of the investigative process. Detective Tagaloa was targeted because his investigation was too good, because his commitment to the facts was too strong, and because his pursuit of the truth was too relentless to be derailed by any conventional means. The fact that his final case resulted in a flawless conviction, even after his murder, is the ultimate testament to the importance of institutional integrity. It demonstrates that when investigators perform their duties with total, unwavering commitment, their work becomes a permanent, indestructible narrative that can survive even the death of the architect. The evidence he gathered, the files he curated, and the chain of custody he maintained became his voice in the courtroom, speaking the truth with an authority that the assassin could never silence. This provides a deep sense of hope for those who work in the trenches of the justice system, that the pursuit of truth is a resilient, self-perpetuating force that ultimately transcends the vulnerability of the individual. In the final analysis, the assassination of Detective Tagaloa is not a story of the triumph of evil, but a story of the endurance of the good. It is a narrative that acknowledges the darkness while celebrating the light of human courage, professional discipline, and the unbreakable resolve of a community that refused to let its future be defined by a single violent event. The memory of the detective is kept alive not through monuments of stone, but through the ongoing work of the individuals who serve their community every single day. They carry forward his commitment, his discipline, and his belief that the law is the only shield strong enough to protect the society they love. The Fagatogo Courthouse, once the scene of an unprecedented horror, now stands as a symbol of institutional strength, a monument to the resilience of a community that stared into the face of violence and chose to move forward with renewed clarity and determination. This is the true, lasting legacy of the case, a legacy that ensures the sacrifice of a hero was not made in vain, but instead became the bedrock upon which a more secure, more just, and more vigilant society was constructed, capable of weathering any storm that may come its way in the years and decades to follow. The echoes of this story will remain relevant as long as we continue to strive for a world governed by laws rather than by the unpredictable whims of human aggression. It serves as a perennial reminder that justice is not a static destination, but a continuous, hard-fought journey. It requires the collective effort of everyone, from the investigator on the street to the juror in the courtroom, to maintain the structures that keep us free from the influence of those who wish to sow chaos. The tragedy in Fagatogo was a moment where the thin, invisible line that keeps civilization from collapsing was tested, and while the wound was deep and the price was immeasurable, the line held. It held because of the courage of a veteran detective, the commitment of his colleagues, and the collective will of a society that decided to define itself by its values rather than by its fears. As we close the final pages of this detailed account, we are left with a profound sense of gratitude for those who stand on the front line of our justice systems, knowing that in their hands lies the preservation of the delicate, sacred, and absolutely essential piece that allows our communities to flourish. Their work is the quiet, steady heartbeat of democracy, a pulse that continues to rhythmically beat, ensuring that the legacy of those who gave their lives in the pursuit of truth remains an eternal, guiding light for all who are charged with the defense of the law, today and for all generations to come. The final contemplation of the Fagatogo tragedy inevitably leads us to the most difficult and profound question of all. How do we honor the dead when the nature of their sacrifice is so public, so violent, and so intricately tied to the very institutions that failed to protect them? The answer, as seen through the lens of the American Samoan experience, lies not in the mere passage of time or the fading of memory, but in the deliberate, active evolution of the system that the victim held most dear. For the legacy of Detective Mike Tagaloa is not preserved in the silence of a grave nor in the cold archives of a criminal case file, but in the living, breathing reality of a justice system that has been hardened, refined, and deeply moralized by the lessons of his murder. His life and his death have become the primary curriculum for a new generation of law enforcement, creating a culture where the concepts of integrity and tactical awareness are inextricably linked. The tragedy created a permanent, indelible imprint on the collective consciousness of the territory, a reminder that the cost of apathy is far higher than the effort required to remain eternally vigilant. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the Fagatogo Supreme Court shooting remain as vital and relevant as they were on that somber day in July. We must acknowledge that the threat to the rule of law is never entirely extinguished. It merely changes form, appearing in new guises, driven by different, yet equally dangerous, motivations. The predator who strikes at the court does not seek a legal victory. He seeks the dissolution of the process itself, helping to create a power vacuum where only the strongest or the most ruthless can survive. By successfully prosecuting the murderer to the absolute maximum extent of the law, American Samoa sent an enduring message that the integrity of the judicial process is non-negotiable. This conviction serves as a deterrent to any future individual who might harbor the same sociopathic delusion that they can manipulate the scales of justice by removing the hands that hold them. It is a message that reverberates through the halls of every government building in the territory, a reminder that the law is not a passive instrument, but an active force of defense for the people it serves. Furthermore, we must reflect on the extraordinary humanity that was displayed in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. While the tragedy focused the world's attention on the act of violence, it was the response of the police department that defined the outcome. In those seconds of pure, unadulterated horror, the responding officers had to choose between the primal instinct of self-preservation and the higher calling of their duty. Their choice to engage the threat, to grapple with the armed assailant, and to secure the scene while their friend lay dying on the pavement, is a testament to the profound strength of the human spirit. It serves as a reminder that the people who wear the badge are not just employees performing a function. They are human beings who are capable of deep loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice. This narrative of heroism should never be eclipsed by the narrative of the crime itself. The act of the killer was a momentary, albeit devastating, interruption of peace, but the act of the officers was a sustained, life-altering commitment to the principles of the law, a commitment that continues to echo through the halls of justice to this day. The process of healing for the community was equally long and arduous. For a society rooted in the values of family and interconnectedness, the realization that such violence could emerge from within their own ranks was a heavy burden to bear. The reconciliation between the traditional social structures of the island and the modern requirements of a secure, transparent, and objective justice system was a difficult journey. It required a collective admission that the old ways of handling social and legal issues, while rooted in deep cultural history, had to adapt to the realities of a more dangerous and complex world. The support provided to the family of the fallen detective and the mourning expressed by the entire territory served to unify the community in a way that reinforced the very bonds the perpetrator had tried to exploit for his own survival. This communal solidarity proved that the values of justice and mutual respect were stronger than the forces of criminal entitlement, providing a foundation for a future where the rule of law is supported not just by the police, but by the will of the people. As the years continue to pass, the story of Detective Tagaloa will undoubtedly undergo the natural process of historical distillation. The raw, jagged edges of the initial trauma will continue to soften, and the event will be viewed more and more through the lens of history, as a critical turning point that necessitated a new era of governance. However, the fundamental truth of the narrative will remain unchanged. Justice is a fragile pursuit, and its existence depends entirely on the resolve of those who are charged with its protection. We must never allow the comforts of our modern, secure systems to lull us into a sense of false security. We must remember that the physical fortifications, the metal detectors, and the security protocols that we see today are not just administrative tools. They are the physical manifestations of a lesson learned in blood. They are the scars of an institution that was wounded but chose to recover. And they exist to ensure that the peace we enjoy is protected against the darkness that will always be waiting at the edges of the light. In our broader journey through the landscape of true crime, we encounter many stories of loss, violence, and institutional struggle. However, the case of the Fagatago Supreme Court holds a special, harrowing resonance precisely because it hits so close to the heart of what we define as civilized. It asks us to confront the vulnerability of the very systems we trust to define our society, and it challenges us to consider what we would be willing to do to preserve them. Detective Tagaloa's life is a masterclass in the value of public service, a life dedicated to the quiet, often thankless task of holding the line against chaos. His death, while a catastrophe, did not result in the destruction of the system. Instead, it resulted in the fortification of it. This is perhaps the greatest triumph of the entire narrative, the realization that even in the face of the ultimate, irreversible tragedy, the institutions of justice possess the capacity to reflect, to reform, and to emerge stronger than they were before. We must also consider the role of the legal professionals, the prosecutors, the judges, and the court staff who continued to walk into the building every day. Even when the memory of the shooting was fresh and the fear of a repeat attack remained palpable. Their work was the true engine of the institutional recovery. By continuing the daily, often mundane work of the court, they demonstrated a refusal to let the violence dictate the terms of their future. They showed that the work of justice is not a singular event that can be stopped by a bullet, but an ongoing, relentless, and essential process that must continue regardless of the threats it faces. Their dedication was the quiet, steady rhythm that allowed the community to begin the long, slow process of moving forward. It is to them, as well as to the law enforcement officers, that we owe a debt of gratitude for the resilience of the judicial system on the island. As we bring this long-form exploration to a final close, we are left with the image of a transformed courthouse, a symbol that continues to stand on the edge of the Pacific, watching over the harbor as it always has, but now representing a much deeper, more complex, and more hardened commitment to the truth. The memory of Detective Tagaloa is embedded in the very foundation of this new reality, a permanent part of the history of the island. He serves as a reminder that the law is not a cold, abstract entity. It is a human endeavor, a promise that we make to one another to live in peace and to resolve our differences not through the force of a weapon, but through the weight of evidence and the clarity of reason. This promise is the most precious thing we possess, and it is the responsibility of every generation to ensure that it remains unbroken. The legacy of this case will endure as long as we continue to value the courage of those who risk everything to protect that promise. And as long as we remain committed to the idea that no matter how much violence may shake the foundations of our world, the light of justice will always be there, shining from the courthouse, waiting for us to return to the path of order, truth, and peace. The final reflection on the assassination of Detective Mike Tagaloa necessitates a comprehensive acknowledgement of the enduring moral weight carried by those who work within the justice system of American Samoa. This narrative, while rooted in the harrowing specifics of a single summer day in 2011, transcends the boundaries of the territory to speak to the universal struggle of maintaining law and order in a world that is frequently volatile and unpredictable. As we look back upon the trajectory of this tragedy, we see not only a story of a life stolen by an act of incomprehensible malice, but also a story of an institutional awakening that has permanently altered the landscape of judicial safety. The legacy of the Fagatago Supreme Court shooting is found in the synthesis of grief and fortitude, where a community looked into the abyss of its own vulnerabilities and chose to construct a future that is more secure, more objective, and more deeply committed to the principles of truth than ever before. Central to this final consideration is the unwavering integrity of the detective himself, whose life's work provided the very mechanism for his own justice. It is a profound irony that the man who had meticulously built the case against the defendant became the only victim who could not see the culmination of his own success. Yet, the fact that his work stood the test of judicial scrutiny, even after his murder, serves as the ultimate professional vindication. It speaks to the standard of excellence he maintained, a standard that did not waver under the pressure of his dangerous surroundings. His story provides a blueprint for what it means to be a public servant, a dedication that exists entirely independent of external circumstances, rooted instead in a deep, internal compass of right and wrong. His memory acts as an ethical anchor for the entire department, a constant, silent reminder that the pursuit of justice is not a job, but a vocation that demands the entirety of one's character. When we consider the broader impact of this tragedy on the concept of the social contract, we realize that the peace we enjoy is far more fragile than we care to admit. The murder was an attack on the foundational belief that there are boundaries, that even the most desperate criminals will not cross the boundary of the courthouse, the boundary of the legal process, and the boundary of the law itself. By shattering these boundaries, the assassin forced the entire society to confront the reality that the rule of law is not a self-sustaining force. It requires constant, active participation, and in times of crisis, it requires a willingness to engage in the difficult work of systemic reform. The transformation of the judiciary was a direct response to this realization, a collective act of will that turned the physical site of the tragedy into a modern, fortified facility. This physical change mirrors the internal shift within the population, as they collectively moved from a state of passive reliance on the system to a state of active, vigilant support for its integrity. The procedural success of the trial, culminating in the permanent removal of the assassin from society, is a testament to the resilience of the judicial machinery. Despite the emotional trauma of the investigators, the potential for public unrest, and the sheer audacity of the crime, the legal system remained unflappable. It processed the evidence with clinical detachment, allowed for the full weight of the law to be applied, and ultimately delivered a verdict that provided the only form of closure possible, the unequivocal acknowledgement of guilt and the absolute, irrevocable punishment of the perpetrator. This outcome was essential for the restoration of public confidence. It demonstrated that even when the most heinous of crimes is committed, the system is capable of functioning as intended, immune to the pressures of intimidation and the influence of powerful family names. This reaffirmation of the impartiality of justice is, perhaps, the most important outcome of the entire saga. Furthermore, we must acknowledge the long-term emotional recovery of the law enforcement community. The loss of a mentor like Detective Tagaloa creates a ripple effect that touches every future interaction, every investigative decision, and every ethical choice made by the officers who survive him. The camaraderie that defines the police force was put to the ultimate test, and it emerged stronger, tempered by the shared grief of the loss and the shared pride in the heroic response to the shooting. This bond is the invisible mortar that holds the system together, ensuring that when the next crisis inevitably arrives, the response will be as disciplined, as courageous, and as focused as it was in the shadow of the Supreme Court. The department has become more than just a functional unit. It has become a living memorial to the man who led by example, whose life continues to guide their daily service to the public. As we conclude this extended examination, we are also forced to consider the role of the public in the maintenance of justice. The residents of American Samoa played a critical role in the aftermath by refusing to be intimidated and by supporting the necessary, albeit inconvenient, changes to their judicial institutions. Their collective willingness to accept the new reality of security screenings, restricted access, and a more robust police presence is a reflection of a society that values its safety and its justice above the minor luxuries of convenience. This level of civic engagement is essential for the health of any democratic institution. It demonstrates that the law is not an external imposition but a shared commitment, a collective agreement to value the truth over the illusions of power. The legacy of the detective is thus not just limited to the police force. It is embedded in the cultural evolution of the entire territory. Looking ahead, the story of this case will continue to serve as a vital narrative in the broader tapestry of true crime. It reminds us that behind every case file, every statistic, and every courtroom outcome, there are human beings whose lives are irrevocably changed by the choices of those who seek to do harm. The detective, the assassin, the responding officers, the witnesses, and the members of the jury are all actors in a drama that is as old as the concept of law itself. The story of Fagatogo is a reminder that the pursuit of truth is a noble, if inherently dangerous, endeavor. It requires us to face the darkness without losing sight of the light, to struggle against the forces of chaos without losing our commitment to the rule of law, and to remain steadfast in the belief that, no matter how much the foundations of our society are shaken, the truth will always have a place where it can be heard and where justice can be done. The courthouse stands today as a testament to this truth. It is no longer just a building. It is a monument to the resilience of the human spirit. The memory of Detective Mike Tagaloa is etched into the very walls, a constant presence that continues to inspire and to humble all those who pass through its doors. His life, while cut short by a senseless act of violence, has yielded a legacy that is immense and enduring. By choosing to move forward, to learn from the tragedy, and to rebuild the foundations of their justice system, the people of American Samoa have ensured that the memory of their fallen hero will never be forgotten. They have turned a moment of profound darkness into a lasting, shining example of what it means to defend the truth. As we leave this story behind, let us carry the lesson with us that the law is not a guarantee, but a promise that we must keep every single day through our words, our actions, and our unwavering commitment to the noble, essential, and difficult work of justice. It is a promise that has been kept time and time again by the brave men and women who serve, and it is a promise that will continue to be kept. Ensuring that the light of truth remains the guiding principle of our society far into the future, protecting the innocent and holding the guilty accountable in the hallowed halls where justice is forever preserved. The final chapter of this profound and tragic narrative is not found in the court records or the physical changes to the judiciary, but in the enduring spirit of the community that refused to be defined by a singular act of violence. The assassination of Detective Mike Tagaloa remains a pivot point in the history of American Samoa, a moment where the territory's internal identity was forced to confront the harsh realities of the modern world. In our comprehensive journey through the facts and the aftermath of this event, we have seen how a single, cold-blooded decision by a desperate man triggered a cascade of systemic reactions that reshaped a society. This final reflection serves to synthesize the essence of this story, emphasizing that the true victory of justice in this case was not merely the successful conviction of a murderer, but the resilience of the people who continued the work of the men they lost. The legacy of the detective is intrinsically linked to the collective resolve of a territory that decided, in the face of its darkest hour, that the rule of law was an absolute value, not to be bargained with or surrendered under the pressure of terror. As we bring this account to a close, we must recognize the immense psychological fortitude required by those who walked into the courthouse in the days following the murder. Every attorney, judge, and clerk who entered the building was returning to the scene of a traumatic crime, a place that had been stained by the blood of a hero. Their return was not an act of bureaucratic indifference. It was a defiant statement of purpose. It affirmed that the business of justice is essential to the survival of the community and that no amount of fear or violence would be permitted to derail it. This commitment, often hidden from the public eye and occurring in the quiet, methodical execution of legal duties, is the heartbeat of any functioning democratic system. It represents the quiet, daily heroism that keeps the machinery of order in motion, ensuring that the work of the law continues even when the human cost of that work is painfully visible. The story also emphasizes the vital importance of the investigation itself as a tool for public healing. By conducting a forensic reconstruction of the murder that was so meticulous and so scientifically unimpeachable, the police department provided the community with the certainty they needed to process their grief. There were no lingering questions about who had committed the crime, no ambiguity regarding the motive, and no space for conspiracy theories to take root and cause further social discord. The investigation was an act of transparency that honored the victim's own commitment to the truth. It provided a clear, undeniable narrative that the community could rally around, fostering a sense of collective closure that would have been impossible had the investigation been compromised. This aspect of the case demonstrates that the most effective way to address the trauma of a high-profile crime is to ensure that the process of discovery is as rigorous and as honest as possible, thereby upholding the dignity of the victim and the integrity of the judicial system. Furthermore, we must reflect on the broader societal shift that occurred regarding the perception of law enforcement. Before the shooting, the police were respected but were also seen as an integrated part of the social fabric, often operating with a high level of informal familiarity. The tragedy forced a shift toward a more professionalized, tactically aware, and formalized posture. This was not a move to distance the police from the people they served, but to equip them to protect that relationship from external and internal threats. The modern American Samoan police force, with its advanced training and heightened focus on officer safety, is a direct evolution from the lessons of 2011. They have inherited the mantle of Detective Tagaloa, bearing the weight of his legacy with a professionalism that is both a tribute to his life and a shield for the future of the territory. This evolution is a clear signal that the sacrifice of the detective was not in vain, as it catalyzed a period of modernization that has left the island significantly better prepared to address the complexities of modern crime. The role of the media and the public discourse in this process cannot be understated. By maintaining a focus on the facts and the tragedy rather than sensationalizing the crime, the local community and those reporting on it contributed to a culture of sober reflection. There was a palpable sense of communal ownership over the incident, a recognition that this was not something that had happened to someone else, but something that had happened to the collective. This sense of shared burden and shared responsibility is what enabled the territory to move forward with such a high degree of unity. It fostered a resilience that allowed the community to acknowledge the reality of the threat while refusing to let that threat dictate the future. This unified front was crucial in supporting the government's efforts to reform the judicial system, as there was little public pushback against the necessary security upgrades, even as those upgrades fundamentally changed the character of public access to the court. As we look toward the horizon, we recognize that the story of Detective Mike Tagaloa will continue to serve as a beacon for the values of courage and truth. His life was defined by the simple, unwavering belief that the law exists to protect the vulnerable and that the truth is a goal worth any sacrifice. These are the values that define the best of our civilization, and they are the values that we must continue to defend in every corner of the world. The tragedy in Fagatogo is a reminder that these values are not automatically preserved. They are forged, tested, and sometimes paid for in the most heart-wrenching ways possible. The endurance of the legal system and the resilience of the community after the shooting provide us with an optimistic perspective on the human capacity to overcome even the most daunting of challenges. We see that the structures of justice are capable of surviving the loss of their most dedicated servants because the principles they represent are bigger than any single person. And the commitment to those principles is a force that transcends the individual. In the end, this case is a narrative of continuity. It is a reminder that while the individuals who serve our communities may come and go, the institution of the law remains as a constant, protecting the rights and the safety of the citizens. The courthouse, with its fortified doors and modern security, is not just a building. It is a monument to the endurance of the communities will to live under the rule of law. It stands as a silent sentinel, reflecting the memory of the past while looking forward to a future where such tragedies are consigned to history. The detective, whose life was taken in the service of this law, is forever part of the identity of that institution. a spirit that continues to walk its corridors and guide the hands of those who continue his work. His voice remains in the arguments made by prosecutors, his vigilance remains in the work of the investigators, and his integrity remains in the decisions made by the judges who occupy the bench today. We conclude this exploration with a sense of profound respect for the resilience of the human condition and the enduring power of justice. The story of American Samoa in the summer of 2011 is a story that has been told and retold, each time serving to reinforce the importance of integrity, the necessity of vigilance, and the absolute beauty of a life lived in service to others. It is a story that teaches us that when we face the darkness, we must reach out to one another, hold our institutions close, and never, ever lose sight of the truth. Detective Tagaloa stood for this truth until his final breath, and it is our collective responsibility to ensure that his legacy continues to inspire those who follow in his footsteps. As the world continues to move forward, and as new challenges to our systems of law and order arise, we look back to this case as a point of reference, a reminder that the light of justice, though it may flicker in the face of violence, can never be extinguished as long as there are those who are willing to stand, to serve, and to defend the principles that define our shared humanity. This is the final, enduring lesson of Fagatogo, and it is a lesson that will remain as vital and as essential as the laws themselves for all the years to come, ensuring that the legacy of the fallen hero continues to breathe through the institutions he gave his life to protect, guarding the peace of his island home forever.